timing of it.
I usually give them 5 minutes. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. This hearing is entitled Fair Housing Act, Reviewing Efforts to Eliminate Discrimination and Promote Opportunity in Housing. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes for an opening statement. Good morning, everyone. Today, the committee convenes for a hearing on the Fair Housing Act to review efforts to eliminate discrimination and promote equal opportunity in housing. April is National Fair Housing Month, and last April marked the 50th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act, the landmark 1968 legislation that outlawed housing discrimination. But here we are 51 years after the Fair Housing Act became law, and housing discrimination remains a widespread problem in this country. According to the National Fair Housing Alliance, individuals filed 28,843 housing discrimination complaints in 2017. Under the Trump administration, fair housing protections are under attack. In 2018, HUD Secretary Ben Carson halted implementation of the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, an important rule finalized by the Obama administration that provides community with greater clarity on how to help break down barriers to fair housing opportunity, including by providing local authorities with better data to analyze their housing needs. According to news reports, Secretary Carson proposed taking the words, quote, free from discrimination, quote, unquote, out of HUD's mission statement. He also reported the halted fair housing investigations and sidelined top advisors in HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. These are unprecedented attacks on fair housing that must not go unanswered. Let's not forget that Donald Trump and his father were once charged with violating the Fair Housing Act for discriminating against African American and Puerto Rican renters. Given that Trump was engaged in housing discrimination himself, it is unsurprising that his administration has been so hostile to fair housing protections. My bill, the Restoring Fair Housing Protections Eliminated by HUD Act, is designed to put protections that Ben Carson and the Trump administration have diminished back in place. The legislation requires HUD to implement the AFFH rule as soon as possible, codifies HUD's mission statement in statute, and requires HUD to reverse other harmful actions the Trump administration has taken to weaken fair housing. It is also important to recognize that as technology has evolved, so too are the ways that Americans are searching for and finding housing. A recent study found that 73% of all renters use online platforms to find housing. Regulators must be proactive in scrutinizing online platforms where housing is advertised to ensure that the algorithms and targeting tools are not being utilized to discriminate against minority groups. It is a positive development that following public pressure from advocates, HUD reversed its decision to halt this investigation into Facebook and allowed HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity to charge Facebook with violating their Fair Housing Act. However, much more must be done to ensure that digital platforms are not being used for housing discrimination. So I look forward to discussing these matters with our panel of experts and hearing their insights on fighting discrimination and ensuring that there are fair housing opportunities for every American. With that, I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Mr. McHenry, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, I thank you, Chairwoman Waters. Achieving fairness in housing entails several dimensions that should be a shared goal. First is a legal requirement, our shared commitment to the elimination of discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing, which Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, the Fair Housing Act, made unlawful. Second is the desire to promote opportunity in housing. Curiously, the phrase promote opportunity is not in the Fair Housing Act. In fact, the phrase equal opportunity is only mentioned once in the over 11,000 words of the Fair Housing Act, something I'll touch on before I end. One last dimension is the concept of fairness. The very first section of the Fair Housing Act consists of a simple but perhaps inscrutable sentence. It is the policy of the United States to provide, within constitutional limitations, for fair housing throughout the United States. The Fair Housing Act deputized HUD to lead the effort to enforce the rules and prohibitions on local communities and provide landlords, sellers, and lenders alike rules and regulations that they need to abide by. 50 years later, here's what we know. The efforts to eliminate the sort of discrimination contemplated by the Fair Housing Act, indeed the Civil Rights Act, is and continues to be an issue today. And we should not mistake the clear progress made on that front for success in the overall battle. There's still work to be done, and this hearing is a good opportunity to ask how the Fair Housing Act can be the best tool to advance fair housing in the 21st century. The Fair Housing Act is focused on prohibiting certain acts, but not necessarily promoting opportunity. If the goal is to build inclusive communities, you need both approaches to be successful. There is no single greater barrier to fair housing opportunities than poverty. Yet, it might surprise people to learn that the word poverty is not even mentioned once in the Fair Housing Act, nor is income. An increased focus on fighting poverty would help to promote opportunity. I'm pleased that Secretary Carson has been talking about the need to develop incentives, not just punishments, at the local level to better design and align housing incentives like opportunity zones, which we passed into law just over a year ago. And these opportunity zones will help low-income communities the most, and that is the intention. Technology also can and must play a bigger role in how we approach building 21st century communities. HUD simply cannot do its job by demanding an endless stream of 1,000-page reports to monitor local development in New York or Philadelphia or Ashland, Wisconsin, or Asheville, North Carolina, requiring local communities to spend months compiling lengthy reports, and HUD officials spending weeks to review them misses the mark. This approach is too heavy on process and devalues real, recognizable violation standards that demand prompt attention and resolution. Instead, we ought to have a system that prioritizes prompt action for all overt violations of the Fair Housing Act. In his remarks at the signing of the bill to create HUD, President Lyndon Johnson notes, quote, "Those who do not find new means to respond to new challenges will perish or decay." I concur. President Johnson nailed it with that statement back in 1965, and I think that should be a mindset that we have on this committee, especially when it comes to housing policy. And with that, I thank the Chairwoman Waters for having this hearing and look forward to the panel.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, the chair of the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, Insurance, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I look forward to working closely with you as we fight to reform the housing finance system to ensure that underserved borrowers in our more challenged neighborhoods, like many of those in my hometown of St. Louis, have access to mortgages, insurance, and fair appraisals to give them a real chance at home ownership. Democrats are committed to upholding the Fair Housing Act and fighting for a housing market that is free from discrimination. The Fair Housing Act, passed in 1968, prohibits discrimination in the housing market and requires state and local governments and other recipients of federal housing funding to affirmatively further fair housing. In January of 2018, under Secretary Carson's role, he implemented of the agency, he arbitrarily halted implementation of the agency's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And in my role as subcommittee chair, I will be taking action to help restore the hard-fought fair housing protections that the Trump administration has weakened. I yield back.
Thank you. Today we welcome a distinguished panel of witnesses to discuss issues around fair housing. Debbie Goldberg, Vice President, Housing Policy and Special Projects, National Fair Housing Alliance. Kashwana Hill, Executive Director, Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center. Kiara Johnson, Deputy Executive Director, National LGBTQ Task Force. Skylar Olson, Director of Economic Research and Outreach, Zello Group. Salim Firth, PhD, Senior Research Fellow, Mercatus Center, George Mason University. Without objection, all of your written statements will be made part of the record. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. When there is 1 minute left, a yellow light will indicate that you should wrap up your testimony. Ms. Goldberg, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters. Good morning, and good morning to Ranking Member McHenry and the members of the committee. And thank you for the opportunity to testify here today. I'm Debbie Goldberg, Vice President for Housing Policy and Special Projects at the National Fair Housing Alliance, or NAFA. NAFA is the only national organization solely dedicated to eliminating housing discrimination in the U.S., and we work with our 200-plus members to achieve that goal through a wide variety of activities. I want to thank you, Chairwoman Waters, and Congressman Green and Clay, and Congresswoman Beatty, and many other members of the committee for the leadership and support for fair housing that you have shown over many years. Today's hearing, looking at our efforts to eliminate discrimination and promote opportunity in housing, is a great way to start Fair Housing Month. I hope it'll help you identify some of our most urgent fair housing issues and some of the steps that you in Congress can take to address them. I want to flag 2 problems that are described in some detail in my written testimony that I don't have time to discuss this morning. One is the need to increase funding for our fair housing enforcement infrastructure. The other is our concern that HUD may effectively eliminate the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, or AFFH, rule. This may be our most important tool for overcoming the lasting harms caused by racial segregation that our federal government helped to create. I urge you to look into both of these problems and would be happy to answer your questions about them. Disparate impact is a tool that protects each of us from forms of discrimination that may be hidden or unintended and are carried out through policies and practices that appear neutral but have a disproportionately harmful effect on protected classes. Those include an array of policies that, among other things, make housing unavailable to families with children, force victims of domestic violence, most often women, and their children to choose between being safe and having a home, and prevent people in communities of color from getting mortgages or obtaining homeowners insurance. HUD's disparate impact rule takes a measured approach to balancing the justifiable needs of housing providers with the harms of discrimination. The tool itself has been around nearly as long as the Fair Housing Act and is well-established policy with a long history of bipartisan support. It has been affirmed uniformly by federal circuit courts as well as the Supreme Court. Despite all this, HUD plans to rewrite, and we fear dismantle, this important rule. We urge the committee to investigate HUD's plans for the disparate impact rule and to use its authorities to protect and preserve it. Finally, I'd like to touch on an issue that has emerged as a new frontier in fair housing, the impact of the increasing use of technology, big data, and artificial intelligence by housing providers. Problems in this space can be difficult to detect, as the data sets and algorithms used are often proprietary. Some have concluded wrongly that systems built on big data and sophisticated algorithms are objective and make it harder to discriminate. The truth is that if these systems rely on data that reflects historic biases deeply embedded in our society, the systems themselves may discriminate. Bias in, bias out. We have seen this in the mortgage market where, among other things, discriminatory credit scoring systems can pose a real barrier to home ownership and wealth building for people of color and others. We're also seeing problems surface in the way housing and related services are marketed. This is illustrated by a case that NAFA recently settled with Facebook. We alleged that Facebook's system for generating and delivering ads allowed providers to prevent members of protected classes, women with kids, people who speak Spanish, people with disabilities, people in specific neighborhoods, and others, from seeing a particular ad. If you never see the ad, you won't ever know what opportunities you've been denied. Facebook has agreed to change its ad portal to eliminate the possibility that advertisers for housing, employment, and credit can use protected characteristics to limit the distribution of their ads and to take other steps to eliminate discrimination on its platform. We look forward to working with Facebook in that process and hope that our settlement will be a model for others in this space. This, too, is an area that would benefit from further investigation by the committee, as well as steps to ensure that other laws, such as the Communications Decency Act, do not impinge on the protections provided under the Fair Housing Act. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Goldberg. Ms. Hill, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Good morning. My name is Kashana Hill, and I serve as Executive Director of the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center. I'd first like to thank you, Chairwoman Maxine Waters, for this opportunity to address the committee and to review GNO Fair Housing's efforts to live up to the mandate of the Fair Housing Act. I, along with my staff and our entire community, am immensely grateful for your consistent support on the issue of fair housing, and we have particularly appreciated your commitment to South Louisiana's recovery following Hurricane Katrina. I would also like to thank Ranking Member McHenry and all members of the committee for welcoming us here today to discuss full and effective enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Action Center is a nonprofit civil rights organization established in 1995 to eradicate housing discrimination and segregation. I want to begin with the story of one of our clients to emphasize the real-life impacts of the protections afforded by the Fair Housing Act. In 2014, a nursing student named Marilyn was living in New Orleans and celebrating Christmas with her 3-year-old son. Marilyn invited her son's father to visit the child over the Christmas holidays. However, the visit ended with him violently assaulting her. Marilyn was transported to the hospital for treatment while her ex was arrested. After her release from the hospital the next day, she returned home to find a notice on her door, letting her know that she was being evicted and would lose her home because of the complex's zero-tolerance policy on domestic violence. Louisiana's landlord-tenant laws allow evictions with only 5 days' notice, so Marilyn had just a few days to find a new home. When Marilyn found the Fair Housing Action Center, our attorneys on staff, partially funded by HUD's Fair Housing Initiatives program, took her case for free. Our legal team discovered that Maryland's landlords, a property management company with over 2,000 rental units in 3 southern states, required their tenants to sign leases agreeing that any, quote, participation in a domestic violence incident was grounds for eviction. To help Maryland, the Fair Housing Action Center made use of a 2013 HUD rule and legal theory later upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court known as disparate impact. That theory holds that some policies that seem neutral, like the complex's zero-tolerance policy, can unfairly exclude certain groups of people. In this case, the policy had a disparate impact on women who are most likely to be victims in domestic violence incidents. After her case settled, Marilyn continued to advocate for changes to Louisiana state law to protect women in similar situations. Due to her efforts, together with GNO Fair Housing's policy staff and a statewide coalition of advocates and domestic violence survivors, the Louisiana legislature passed new protections for survivors in 2015. In addition to showing the impact that enforcement of fair housing laws can have on American families, Maryland's story is important because chronic underfunding and delays in administration are jeopardizing our ability to enforce the Fair Housing Act. GNO Fair Housing's work to support Maryland would not have been possible without the FIP program. I would now like to turn briefly to affirmatively furthering fair housing. As the committee is aware, the Fair Housing Act was not implemented solely to prevent individual acts of discrimination, but also to address historic patterns of segregation. The affirmatively furthering fair housing process is essential because an overwhelming number of studies show that where you live determines much about how you will live, and even how long you will live. As an example from New Orleans, life expectancies in 2 of the city's neighborhoods differs by more than 25 years. In the neighborhood in the shadow of the Superdome, a community that is more than 90% Black, the average resident lives only to the age of 62. Meanwhile, in a community less than 3 miles away that is more than 90% white, the average resident lives to be 88. In October of 2016, New Orleans completed the very first assessment of fair housing, a new fair housing plan required under the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. GNO Fair Housing, with support from philanthropic partners, led the community engagement process for this plan. The transparent, collaborative planning process resulted in unprecedented community input that produced comprehensive policy recommendations that provide a clear path forward and have since been lifted up as a model for the nation. Nowhere is the focus on affirmatively furthering fair housing more important than after life-altering disasters that change the face of entire cities and regions. As I close, I'll note that 10 years after the storm, the city of New Orleans began to publicly discuss policies to address the gentrification that had already and continues to displace many long-term neighborhood residents. For cities that are in the midst of recovery or will be from future disasters, we cannot afford to wait 10 years before beginning to consider the mandate of the Fair Housing Act. It instead must be a foundational part of disaster recovery. On behalf of the Greater New Orleans Fair Housing Action Center, I truly appreciate the opportunity to offer this testimony, and I will gladly answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Johnson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
My name is Kiara Johnson, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the National LGBTQ Task Force. I want to thank the members of this committee for taking the time to address such a very important issue. As a bisexual person, I especially want to thank the committee for inviting a member of the LGBTQ community here today. It is rare for discussions on housing discrimination to center the experiences of LGBTQ people, but it shouldn't be. Housing discrimination complaints are filed by LGBTQ people at a similar rate to race discrimination complaints filed by people of color. And approximately 1 in 4 transgender people in the US have experienced some form of housing discrimination because of their gender identity. Courts and state and local legislators have worked to make housing protections for LGBTQ people more explicit, but still protections are inconsistently applied, and enforcement is even more unpredictable. There are real consequences when we fail in our duty to protect LGBTQ people. For example, nearly 1/3 of transgender people have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. And while LGBTQ young people make up maybe 6 or 7% of the general population, 40% of young people, 40% experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ. To be clear, people end up homeless not from a lack of trying, but because they are unable to find or keep housing. So again, as a queer person, I am appreciative to have been asked to be a part of this conversation. As a Black queer mother of 2, I am also disappointed that it is rare to center the experiences of queer people in conversations about housing. When the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, it promised protections from discrimination in housing on the basis of race, color, religion, and national origin. There wasn't an asterisk at the end of those protections. It didn't say all Black people are protected unless you're a woman. It didn't say all Latinx people are protected unless you're living with a disability. And it didn't say all Muslim and Jewish people are protected unless you're gay. But in practice, people who wanted to discriminate sought out gaps in the law, and they exploited them. A landlord could say, I'm not racist, I just don't rent to unwed mothers. A mortgage broker could say, I'm not anti-Semitic, I just think that with his disability, he's too much of a credit risk. Congress has worked hard to close those gaps over the years. Since 1968, sex, disability, and familial status have been explicitly named in the FHA so that those don't function as gaps in the law. But there's still work to be done. I am a Black queer woman with 2 beautiful, brilliant boys. When a landlord won't call me back or a bank won't approve a loan, I don't know if it's because I'm Black or because I went to see an apartment with my partner. I don't know if it's because I have 2 children or because I'm a man. I just don't know. And if I try to challenge that decision, there's a good chance I'll fail. The landlord knows that because sexual orientation isn't explicitly named in the law. There is a gap he can exploit, and the chances of him experiencing any consequences from his bias drop significantly. These are the cracks that the people you represent slip through. Everyday people with dreams and families, responsibilities, and a human desire to live with dignity. There are answers to this. The Equality Act would protect LGBTQ people in housing. The Landlord Accountability Act would cover low-income people who have housing vouchers. And the Fair Chance at Housing Act would help formerly incarcerated people secure stable housing. I call on the members of this committee to think about what it means to leave these groups of people without explicit protections. Do we not care about Black and brown people unless they're straight? Do we not care about women unless they have never been so hopeless as to commit a criminal act to survive? Do we not care about people with disabilities unless they have enough money not to need a housing voucher? I hope not. I thank you for the time you've given me today and the time you take to fight for these protections tomorrow.
Thank you. Dr. Olson, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and distinguished members of the committee, it is an honor to appear before you today at this important hearing. My name is Dr. Skylar Olson. I am the Director of Economic Research at Zillow. Zillow Group was founded with the mission to improve transparency in the housing market and is dedicated to empowering consumers with data, inspiration, and knowledge around the place they call home. Zillow Group operates economic research teams at Zillow, Trulia, StreetEasy, and HotPads, which leverage available data to produce timely and relevant economic research. We conduct regular analyses on the health of the market, which include housing market dynamics and forecasting, and also tackle specific issues of national interest, such as declining housing affordability and homelessness. All of this research is publicly available. In addition, Zillow makes much of our aggregated data free and downloadable to the public and offers academics and government agencies a public record data set to support their own research. We see our role as using our data to help inform important conversations. In recent years, Zillow Group has published a growing body of research addressing existing disparities in the housing market. At a high level, our work demonstrates that housing inequities persist across the United States today, as reflected in government-reported data, the amenities available in different communities, and in consumers' experiences in their search for housing. I'd like to share some of that data with you today. I'll start with homeownership, a key tool for building wealth. In the year 1900, the gap between Black and white homeownership rates was 27.6 percentage points. In 2016, over 115 years later, the gap was actually wider at 30.3 percentage points. At the same time, Black borrowers are denied for conventional home loans at approximately 2.5 times more than that of white borrowers. Zillow data has also examined home value appreciation in neighborhoods that were historically redlined, based at least in part on the racial composition of those neighborhoods. We found that those areas formerly deemed best and appropriate for lending are now worth 2.3 times those previously marked as hazardous and inappropriate for lending. Disparities are also visible in the amenities present in local communities. Trulia's research team, with input from the National Fair Housing Alliance and Ohio State University, looked at 4 major metro areas: Atlanta, Detroit, Houston, and Oakland. This research found that predominantly non-white census tracts had 35% fewer traditional banking establishments, 38% fewer healthcare service establishments, and 34% fewer active or healthy lifestyle amenities such as parks, playgrounds, and recreation centers, as compared to tracts that were predominantly white. Finally, we've also engaged in research on consumer experiences and perceptions. According to the Zillow Group Consumer Housing Trends Report, a nationally representative annual survey of consumer sentiment, Home buyers of color were less likely than white buyers to say they were satisfied with all aspects of their home buying experience. 43% of white buyers reported full satisfaction, compared to only 27% of Black, 24% of Hispanic, and 23% of Asian respondents. The survey also revealed that it takes more time for Asian, Black, or Hispanic home shoppers to have their rental application or offer accepted. On average, Hispanic renters submit 5.5 rental applications, and Black and Asian renters submit 3.6 before finding a rental home. This is compared with only 2.5 for white applicants. The perception of housing discrimination is also strong among U.S. adults. In a nationally representative survey conducted last fall, 27% of respondents said that they believe they have been treated differently in their search for housing because of their status in a protected group, including because of race, skin color, disability status, and others. Zillow Group believes that all Americans deserve to find a home free from discrimination in the process. Yet these data points help illustrate the breadth of inequities and frustrations that many Americans still experience in their home search and in their communities. We appreciate the opportunity to share this research with the committee and hope it will help inform the committee's discussions on these important issues.
Thank you, Dr. Firth. You are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your oral testimony.
Good morning, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and members of the committee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to address you today. My name is Salim Firth, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where I am co-director of the Urbanity Project. I study land use regulations that are barriers to opportunity. My comments today will focus on the details of the affirmatively furthering fair housing rulemaking. Contemporary American land use embodies the bad idea that private land use ought to be publicly planned. In practice, these plans routinely exclude low-income families by indirect means, causing income-based segregation. In this environment, how should federal policymakers respond? They should resist the temptation to implement anything like nationalized or statewide zoning. What they can and should do is amend the ways in which federal policy interacts with local government to encourage and facilitate inclusion and to stop subsidizing extremely exclusionary local policies. In this spirit, my colleague and co-director Emily Hamilton and I submitted a public interest comment to HUD to suggest specific revisions to the AFFH rule. The 2015 AFFH rule is based in an important but vague admonition in the Fair Housing Act that the Secretary shall act in a manner affirmatively to further the purposes of this subchapter. In layman's English, I take this to mean that HUD has to abide by the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law. Exclusionary zoning seems like a clear example of government violating the spirit of the Fair Housing Act without technically discriminating against any protected class. HUD, under both the current and previous administrations, seems to agree. But when HUD makes grants to localities that are actively fighting the construction of modest amounts of rental housing, Cupertino, California comes to mind, it is not affirmatively furthering fair housing. The 2015 AFFH rule, however, has not led to any change in HUD's grant-making behavior. Cupertino is in good standing and has received a community development block grant to rebuild some sidewalks. In the year and a half during which the 2015 AFFH rule was used by HUD, a pattern emerged. Entitlement communities would submit a long document, HUD staff would review and send it back for corrections. The document would grow even longer. When it was finally done, the entitlement community would be qualified to receive funding for the next 5 years. The documents typically contained analysis of segregation and demographics, as well as some plans to improve policy. There were, however, no teeth, and I am unaware, perhaps people can correct me, of a single local policy that was changed as a direct consequence of this rule. Hamilton and I offer 3 principles for the revision of the AFFH rule. 1, the rule should evaluate enacted policies and market outcomes, not plans. 2, the rule should be easy to administer. And 3, the rule should have real teeth. Following these principles promotes fair housing more effectively and with less wasted effort. The AFFH rule made lots of work for planners without taking seriously the elected decision makers. HUD should reverse this emphasis. To be in good standing with HUD, jurisdictions should be able to point to market outcomes and enacted policies that are consistent with inclusion and strong property rights. Second, HUD ought to strive for ease of administration. By all accounts, an extraordinary amount of work when it's preparing and evaluating the fair housing assessments required by the AFFH rule. But do not mistake administrative burden for policy rigor. Standing in a long line at the DMV doesn't make you a better driver. Our final principle is that the AFFH rule ought to have real consequences, at least for egregiously exclusive grantees. How can the Secretary of HUD be acting affirmatively to further fair housing when he or she approves grants to jurisdictions that have high and rising rent, issue few housing permits, and are unwilling to change policy to allow more housing construction? There are many ways to put teeth into AFFH. The most obvious is for highly exclusionary jurisdictions to lose access to CDBG funds for a time. CDBG funds are the ideal carrot or stick because they are rarely used for housing. Under existing statute, however, this is difficult and would probably result in lawsuits. A softer set of teeth would be to require that CDBG funds in highly exclusionary jurisdictions be spent directly on low-income housing. In our public interest comment, Hamilton and I outlined one particular approach for the AFFH rule, but there are many ways to implement our principles. With the help of this committee, HUD can and should revise the AFFH rule to focus on enacted policies and market outcomes rather than plans, to ease the costs of administration, and to have real financial consequences. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Firth. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Ms. Goldberg, I'm concerned that HUD and Congress are woefully behind when it comes to understanding modern housing discrimination. Today, an astounding 73% of renters find housing online, and even higher percentage of millennials do so. While technological advances have expanded access to knowledge and information, these innovations are enabling old discriminatory practices to flourish. Your organization recently settled its lawsuit with Facebook over the social media company's discriminatory targeting of advertisements. Just last week, HUD announced its own fair housing charges against the company. This was the first secretary-initiated complaint for the Trump administration, even though previous administrations regularly brought such cases. Reading the charges, the public may also be surprised to learn that HUD Secretary Carson originally halted this investigation when he took office. According to the charge, Facebook provided advertisers, including mortgage lenders, real estate agencies, and housing developers with, quote, a map tool to exclude people who live in a specified area from seeing an ad by drawing a red line around the area, quote, unquote. This is eerily familiar to when the Federal Housing Administration drew red lines around Black and brown communities, systematically starving them of access to capital and lending. Today, it seems Facebook is enabling advertisers to write their own discriminatory maps and get paid to do so. What is troubling is that due to algorithmic black boxes, communities are not always well positioned to know when this is happening, and accordingly, to file complaints regarding online discrimination. Facebook is but one of the many new platforms online, and unfortunately, HUD, under this administration, which is in a position to enforce the law, has to be shamed by fair housing advocates into investigating serious violations of the Fair Housing Act. How can we strengthen enforcement of the Fair Housing Act to ensure that there are safeguards online, and that companies like Facebook comply with the law?
Thank you for that question, Chairwoman Waters. I think there are a number of things that, that Congress can do. One is to increase funding for private, nonprofit fair housing groups, like the one that Ms. Hill next to me here runs, that do investigations. We partnered with several of our members, not New Orleans, but several others, in doing our Facebook investigation. But resources are always scarce. These investigations take time and money, and allocating more money to serve that purpose would be helpful. I would also add that HUD itself, in its Office of Fair Housing, needs more funding and more staff and greater resources in order to be able to carry out its responsibilities more effectively, one of which should be, along perhaps with several other federal agencies that have a role to play in the regulation of technology, in that space, being more proactive about looking at how these different platforms operate and whether or not the systems that they use are functioning to discriminate. As you note, if you can't see what's going on, if you don't know what the data say or the algorithms do, you don't know whether discrimination is happening. So greater transparency, greater investigation, I think, would be helpful. The other thing I want to underscore is something that was not particularly relevant to our Facebook case, but is an issue in other online platforms, which is the conflict that exists at the moment between the Communications Decency Act and the Fair Housing Act, where courts have interpreted the CDA to trump the Fair Housing Act and allow for discriminatory advertisements to appear on certain platforms in the name of free speech. And we think that that's a problem that really needs to be rectified. I don't think it's what was intended, but it's how it stands now.
Thank you very much. Let me just follow up for a moment. Did Facebook admit and recognize and make some commitments to change?
Yes, Facebook made, well, so I don't believe that in the settlement, Facebook acknowledged doing wrong, as is typical of these kinds of settlements, but it did make a number of changes, or commitments to make a number of changes, including setting up a new portal for advertisements for housing credit and employment that will not have the discriminatory options that were on its platform in the past. It will also set up a portal where anybody, anywhere in the country, can look at the ads, the housing-related ads that have been posted. So it gets us past this problem of, you never saw the ad because you weren't targeted for it, right? And in addition, because there are concerns about what happens after an ad has been developed, approved, and then gets to be delivered, that even though we've taken some of the discriminatory options out of the ad targeting, that the algorithms may themselves generate additional discriminatory patterns. Facebook has agreed to work with us and a range of experts to study those patterns over time and take additional steps to correct any problem.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the distinguished ranking member for 5 minutes for questions.
So I think we all agree, I hope we all agree, that we need the Fair Housing Act. So let me just go across the panel. Let's see if we can get some agreement here. Do you all agree with that we believe that we need the Fair Housing Act? Ms. Goldberg?
Absolutely.
So.
Yes.
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 All right. Well, this is good. It's Washington, so we have to start with some sense of commonality where we can get it. So, do you believe that in order for the Fair Housing Act to work, we need effective tools to prevent discrimination or to eliminate the practice, or rules to eliminate the practice of discrimination? Yes.
Yes, I think that's one part of meeting the goals of the Fair Housing Act, yes.
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 Thank you. And so, Mr. Firth, you outlined in a piece in October of last year entitled Ben Carson's Approach to Affordable Housing Might Work. One quote I pulled from there is, Carson's HUD suspended the affirmative furthering fair housing rule in 2018 and plans to reframe it to challenge the exclusionary land use regulations of cities and counties that receive HUD funding. This approach is promising and represents an appropriate exercise of federal power that restores property rights and hopefully will help to reduce poverty. Do you believe, Dr. Firth, do you believe that the process that resulted in HUD's 2015 affirmatively furthering fair housing rule was ineffective? And if so, why?
So I take your question to mean was the rule itself?
Was the 2015 rule ineffective? And if so, why?
So it appears to have been ineffective to me. Some people think we should have given it longer to operate before drawing that conclusion, and reasonable people can differ on that point. But to me, it helped jurisdictions that wanted to be inclusive. So if we look at the New Orleans assessment of fair housing, it's great, it has lots of good things, and they tried to follow up on those policies. But if we look at communities that didn't want to be inclusive, it didn't force them to do anything other than fill out this report. So they had to do a bunch of reporting, and the staff had to make a lot of plans. But the staff plans don't bind the elected officials. We have to take local self-government seriously. It exists, and these local decisions are made by elected officials who answer to their voters. They don't often always make decisions that we agree with, And for HUD, at least HUD should say, well, if you are going to make decisions that are routinely exclusionary, we are not going to participate.
Okay, so here's the question. Do current HUD rules take into account the cost of local land use regulations?
No, in fact, I believe appropriations bills every year forbid HUD from taking zoning into account.
Okay, so what effect does that have on the supply of affordable housing across the country?
It's massive. So if you look at especially coastal cities where there's a long history of very strict regulation of private land use rights, what we get is a few jurisdictions that have sort of a traditional stock of rental housing, and they're willing to build more. Not a lot more, but a little bit more.
Dr. Olson, does the Zillow data, is that similar to what you've seen in the data, if you've analyzed that component of your data?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, anyone who spends time studying housing markets and how they work and why we do or do not build recognize that a major barrier to adding housing to any community is land use zoning. So to make a more tangible example, 75% of the city of Seattle is zoned for single family only. It's generally easy across.
How does that compare to other localities?
That's pretty normal to have extensive single-family zoning. The other practice that kind of comes through with land use regulations is that it's easy to add density where density already exists. So places that kind of already have that element to it kind of get the more density, more rental apartment units, and then you have these insular communities that are exclusionary that might have access to really great amenities like great schools, where it's harder to add that density, and so it's harder for other communities to kind of access.
So to that point, this is then about income segregation based off of this cost structure that local regulations bears out on the cost of housing.
That is implicitly how kind of things net out at the end. It kind of basically just current land use regulations, one way to think about it is that it reinforces historical redlining over time.
Okay, thank you for your all's testimony. I appreciate the whole panel.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Goldberg, thank you for the National Fair Housing Alliance past support of my bill, the Sexual Harassment Awareness and Prevention Act. As you know, sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination that is prohibited under the Fair Housing Act. However, every day across this country, residents in affordable housing programs face sexual harassment at the hands of landlords, property managers, and others in the housing industry. Can you speak to how affordable housing residents are particularly vulnerable to sexual harassment and misconduct, and how they can often be left homeless because of it?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. It's a terrible problem that people face. The supply of affordable housing that we have in this country is extremely limited. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition estimates that only 1 out of every 4 households that's eligible for assisted housing actually receives that housing. And the housing in the private market, depending on where you're living, may or may not be affordable, or affordable housing may or may not be available in any large numbers in the private market. And so having a unit that you can afford is a very valuable thing that people are very reluctant to give up because there's no guarantee that you're going to find another one. And that puts women in particular in a very vulnerable position.
And can you speak to the fact that this problem, that this is a problem that more than just women face? Can you explain how seniors and individuals in the LGBTQ community also face this threat? And I will ask Ms. Johnson to expand on it too.
Sure, I think you make a very good point that this is not, women may be the largest single category of people who experience this kind of discrimination, but they are certainly not the only one. And I'll defer to Ms. Johnson to speak more.
Thank you. One of my colleagues actually said something that stuck with me. They said that deep poverty and homelessness felt to them like the stripping away of all of their choices in life. They had to take whatever job was available and hang on to it regardless of how degrading and demoralizing. Especially when it was freezing cold or pouring rain, they had to sleep in whatever shelter was available, regardless of whether that space was safe. They had to hide their inner light because living on the street meant constantly putting on a shroud of toughness. They had to fight to protect themselves. They had to steal to eat. They had to beg to survive. And I think this story, right, unfortunately isn't a rare one, but it does point to when people don't have secure housing, when they are discriminated in various ways, when they do find housing, whether it's safe or not, they stay. Mm-hmm. Right? Whether it's degrading or not, whether it's good for their children or not, they stay. And so they're putting themselves and their families in precarious situations when affordable, good quality housing isn't available.
Thank you. Ms. Goldberg, while it is true that HUD does publish an annual report regarding complaints brought under the Fair Housing Act, this report is not detailed enough for Congress and the public to get a clear portrayal of the complaints brought alleging sexual discrimination or harassment. The discussion draft of my bill will require HUD to desegregate this information in several ways, including race, gender, familial status, those with disabilities, and those who are elderly, as well as by the number of complaints filed by state, residents of certain housing programs, and the number of complaints that allege retaliation. How will these additional details help HUD address sexual harassment claims brought by residents?
Having additional detail is always helpful because it lets us see where the problems really lie. And one of the points that you've sort of implied but not made explicitly that I think is really important is the intersectionality of some of these issues, right? People face discrimination for more than one of their characteristics, which can sometimes make it difficult to understand exactly what is going on. And so having the kind of data that you're proposing in your legislation would really shine a light on what's going on and help us understand it better. I would say that we also need ways to make sure that people who may be subject to sexual harassment in housing know what their rights are and know how to pursue them and report them. Because as we said, people feel very vulnerable. They're reluctant to come forward and complain because they're afraid they'll be evicted. And so I suspect that the number of incidents that we see even in the HUD data and the data that our members collect as well is probably far underrepresents what actually happens.
I yield back. Thank you.
The gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairwoman and I thank our witnesses for testifying today. It has been 51 years since the passage of the Fair Housing Act, and while many accomplishments have come from its enactment, there is still much work to be done to ensure its effectiveness. I know that Secretary Carson has turned his attention and a full examination to the alleged redlining by Facebook. He is also, I know, expanded that and looking into and at Google and Twitter in this space also. This question is for both Ms. Goldberg and Dr. Firth. Given that the medium for advertising the rental and sale of real estate has changed with trends towards internet platforms and big data, how can we ensure that HUD has the tools, including advanced technology, to enforce the law as written?
So I would agree that HUD needs, I think this is implied in your question, that HUD needs more resources in order to really be able to understand, evaluate, and where necessary, take action to enforce the Fair Housing Act with respect to the kinds of online platforms that you're describing, and that certainly our case with Facebook illustrates.
Dr. Firth, thank you, Ms. Goldberg. Dr. Firth.
I apologize, I have no expertise in this area, and I defer to my co-panelists.
Dr. Firth, let me ask you this question. In your testimony, and I'll change subjects here, you listed 3 principles for the revision of HUD's 2015 Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. One specific principle you mentioned is that the rule should have real teeth. What sort of changes do you believe would make this rule more enforceable and also result in better outcomes?
My preferred change would be that communities that are extremely exclusionary, and we can debate exactly how to define that, but usually you know them when you see them, that they should be, for a time, a couple of years, maybe the full 5 years, ineligible to receive community development block grants. I actually think, having studied this more since I wrote the public interest comment, that that would actually require further legislation from Congress, and that HUD cannot, under current statute, do that. That's what some lawyer friends have told me. So I would certainly encourage the committee to consider giving HUD the ability or the instruction to leave off places like Brookline, Massachusetts, Cupertino, California, which are very wealthy, well-resourced communities that are essentially through loopholes, I would call them, in the CDBG formula, receiving grants that are intended in statute to be used primarily for low and moderate income families, and they're using that to essentially subsidize a local regime of exclusion.
And I have worked with Congressman Al Green on the other side of the aisle in CDBG DR reform in some of these spaces, and I look forward to advancing that legislation at some point. This rule was not established until 2015. What did communities do up until 2015? Did they operate without standards? Were communities free to do what they wanted?
I think they're still free to operate without standards and do what they want. Up until 2015, there was a process called the analysis of impediments, which was a similar but much lighter version where the staff would sort of put together a little report about how fair housing might be blocked in their community, and they'd submit the report, and it would get filed away, and nothing would happen.
By not having a rule in place, would you say that HUD was opposed to efforts to further the purposes of Fair Housing Act, that HUD was opposed to the Fair Housing Act itself?
No, I don't think so. The affirmatively furthering language is tricky, right? So it says that you're supposed to do things affirmatively, go out of your way to further fair housing, and exactly how you go out of your way to do that is a judgment call, and I'm not calling it to question, 50 years of HUD directors.
Thank you. And Ms. Goldberg, I think I've got a little bit of time left, and you may have wanted to finish discussing some of the tools and resources that are necessary in advancing technology and enforcing the law as written. Please.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Really, two things. One is that I think this is an issue that cuts across more of the federal government than just HUD, and it's a place where an interagency effort would be very helpful. It's not just housing ads, but also credit and employment ads that are at play in our Facebook case, for example. And so I think a broader set of eyes would be helpful. I would also just say very quickly that I think that focusing on zoning alone in the context of affirmatively furthering fair housing misses a big part of the puzzle. It may be a very useful piece, but it misses a big part.
Thank you, Ms. Goldberg. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair Lady Waters. Ms. Hill, let me start with you. 1968, 51 years ago, the Fair Housing Act was passed. And yet here we are with still this piercing discrimination. What would you say, if you had to name one or two or three things, why is that? I mean, 51 years is a long time. And in those 51 years, a ton of resources and money have been put into it. Yet this thing is still so alive. This racial discrimination, sexual orientation. What's going on? What would you put that you could say to us that could really put our finger on this problem?
Thank you. I certainly appreciate the question. And I would say that a big part of why we have not made maybe as much progress in this area as we would have liked is that prior to the 2015 Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, much of the focus in the fair housing conversation was on ending private acts of discrimination. And we really, as a country, hadn't gotten to dealing with the history of racist housing policy in this country. We hadn't gotten to addressing the history of segregation and really working to affirmatively further fair housing by creating and opening the door for open and integrated communities. I'll say that, we've spent some time this morning talking about what affirmatively furthering fair housing means. And, luckily, we don't have to guess as to how that can happen. We all know that former Vice President Walter Mondale is still with us, and he is one of the original sponsors of the Fair Housing Act and has, spoken publicly and been very clear about what that affirmatively furthering fair housing language meant back in 1968. And so we really, as a country, have to focus on working to end the legacy of segregation.
So let me ask you this. We have in place what is called the Housing Choice Vouchers Program. Tell me, is that effective? How does that work?
Well, I can certainly talk about the way that the Housing Choice Voucher Program has played out in New Orleans post-Hurricane Katrina, for example. The promise of the program is that people will take these vouchers and be able to find in the private market housing that works best for themselves and their families. We know that many public housing authorities across the country shifted to this model of more vouchers and less public housing in order to deconcentrate poverty. Unfortunately, in communities across the country and in New Orleans, we've really just, under the voucher system, further concentrated poverty, and in New Orleans, voucher holders have been moved across the Mississippi River and canals following Hurricane Katrina and are resegregated in communities of high poverty.
And let me ask you this, can these these fair housing choice vouchers be used to help pay the rent?
Well, yes, and I think there are a few ways to do that. We know that we haven't quite gotten to the point where the vouchers are meeting the goal of providing free choice in the private market in terms of housing. In New Orleans, our housing authority has been working to roll out a pilot program where the voucher payment standard is adjusted to meet the cost of living in specific neighborhoods.
So I want to make sure I get the right answer here. So these vouchers can be used to help pay the rent?
Well, depending on the neighborhood. And so it is important, I think, from an on-the-ground perspective for housing authorities to have the flexibility to be able to set the payment standard depending on the actual neighborhood.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Goldberg, you had an interesting comment about, you called it disparate impact rule. Could you amplify that a bit in terms of its impact on this issue?
In terms of its impact on housing choice vouchers in particular?
No, well,
or on fair housing in general?
Exactly. You made a very salient point. I remembered part of it, but I did remember what you called it, disparate impact rule.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It's a critical tool that has been just fundamental to enforcing the Fair Housing Act, because not all acts of discrimination are blatant and in your face. Many acts of discrimination, whether or not they're intentional, are carried out through policies and practices that look neutral, like the situation that Ms. Hill described of the apartment complex that would evict somebody if the police were called to their unit, right? That doesn't sound like that's going to discriminate. But in fact, because of who is likely to be the victim of domestic violence, it does have a discriminatory impact. And this rule helps us ferret out and eliminate those kinds of policies.
Gentleman from Florida, Mr.
Thank you very
Posey is
much.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing. At our recent hearing on homelessness and housing affordability, I pointed out that Secretary Carson had stated that local zoning and building restrictions were among the most important contributors to homelessness and to unaffordable housing. When we marked up the Homeless Act, I offered an amendment to provide authority for HUD to use incentives to encourage local communities to reduce zoning measures and other land use practices that serve to restrict the supply of the affordable housing in this country. And it passed with bipartisan support, much to, I think, our great surprise for everyone. Today, 3 witnesses mentioned exclusionary zoning practices as an obstacle to fair housing and access for protected classes. One of the witnesses found his testimony on this obstacle, recommends strong incentives for eliminating such practices, and recommends we look to the market outcomes as metrics to measure the success of our efforts along these lines. I believe that we know, just as reducing zoning restrictions is the path to affordable housing, it's also one of the best practices to ensure fair housing. And so, Mr. Firth, in your testimony, you say rather than relying on local policymakers' vague and unenforceable commitments to integrate HUD should tie the disbursement of CDBG grants to clear requirements for already enacted zoning deregulation reforms to the entitlement process that reduce the cost of building new housing. HUD should set clearly defined metrics at which cities should begin permitting more housing if they want to continue receiving grants. Can you please describe some of those metrics and how they tie into the market outcomes?
Yeah, so market outcomes are essentially when we look at the housing market as it is, what do we see? So we see rent levels, we see how rent is changing, we see whether building permits are being issued, and we can see patterns of segregation and other demographics. So those are the outcomes. Those take time to develop. If you change a policy today, you're not going to see rent or segregation disappear in 1 month. So we should look for the long term. Are these policies having an effect at market outcomes? And then when a community, say a Cupertino, California, says, we've been very exclusionary, but we want to keep getting this CDBG money, so we're going to change a policy. We say, all right, in terms of the outcomes, you don't look great. Your rent is extremely high, and a moderate income person wishing to live here has extremely few options. But, okay, you're going to legalize accessory dwelling units. You're going to expand the land in which multifamily housing can be built. You're going to get rid of parking minimums that drive up the cost of constructing housing. If they do one of those policies, we say, all right, we'll let you in for now, and then we'll reevaluate after some years and see if the outcomes match where we hope this policy would get you. And then at least we're creating, I don't think it's a very powerful incentive. I don't think we are taking away local self-government if we enact something like this, but we're at least saying if a community is exclusionary and unwilling to try to change, then HUD should wash its hands and say, we're not subsidizing that.
Well, I concur. So often in this country, we measure success by how much money we pour into something, not how effectively we get results. And that's definitely a problem. And I appreciate your comments about Dr. Carson looking into the land planning as an attempt, actually the first in his job to attempt to do that. And we know that it makes no sense for a homeless shelter to require 2 parking places per resident, to have 1 bathroom for every resident. We talked in committee a little bit about Mother Teresa had a homeless center she was trying to open in New York. They said, well, you can't do it. There's not enough bathrooms, so I'm going to have to wait in line. So they continued to use the street and sleep on the street. Right. And, that was just a big deficiency in government. So you've proposed that HUD tie the disbursement of community block grants to local communities meeting clear requirements for re-regulating zoning or reforms to the entitlement process that reduce the cost of building new housing, like we just talked about. Does the use of CDBG grants reach enough communities to broadly and consistently provide incentives, or do we need to consider other incentives in addition to those?
That's a great question, and I think one of the best critiques of our proposal is that a lot of very exclusionary communities don't get CDBG. So there are not that many federal levers right now that are useful, and we could certainly consider creating levers, but I would also say fix what you're doing wrong before you create new money pools.
Okay, I didn't have time to ask Ms. Hill a question, but I appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Housing, Community Development, and Insurance, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and let me thank the witnesses for your testimony today. The National Community Reinvestment Coalition released a report on March the 18th that identified more than 1,000 neighborhoods in 935 cities and towns where gentrification occurred between 2000 and 2013. In 230 of those neighborhoods, rapidly rising rents, property values, and taxes forced more than 135,000 residents who are often Black or Hispanic to move away. Right here in Washington, D.C., 20,000 Black residents were displaced, and in Portland, Oregon, 13% of the Black community was displaced. While the study shows the concentration of wealth and the displacement of Black and brown people, the study also found that wealth-building investments are increasingly concentrated in the larger cities, while other regions of the country, like rural areas, tribal areas, and colonias, languish. Ms. Goldberg and Ms. Hill, is gentrification a fair housing issue?
So I think gentrification can be a fair housing issue, certainly, if what it entails is the displacement of people who have been living in a community who are members of protected classes and being displaced by others, right? So what we see, I think, in some cases is people of color living in a community for many years, and whether market forces or public investment or some combination spurs investment, makes the neighborhood more attractive, other forces as well. Housing prices go up, the people who've been living there have been forced out. Where that has a racial impact, or an impact based on national origin, or any other protected class, that can be a fair housing issue.
Let me ask Ms. Hill, what tools exist at the federal level that can help local jurisdictions think through these equity issues so that they can begin to address them?
So I did just want to quickly say that in New Orleans, we are seeing climate gentrification that's been fueled by a flight to higher ground. And so we know that white residents have been far more likely to have the resources to buy land in high ground areas following Hurricane Katrina. So African Americans who before the storm had been living in these high ground neighborhoods bordering the Mississippi River have now been easily displaced by those increasing rents. And so I think it's important to, at the federal level, have some oversight that ensures that local communities are not spending federal disaster dollars in a way that will fuel gentrification and displacement, or in a way that perpetuates segregation.
And thank you for that response. And Ms. Olson, has Zillow done research on this issue directly or with relation to market trends broadly that can shed light on this topic?
Yes, so I think in looking at and we think about gentrification and where the market pressure is, so currently, for example, if I looked at a major metropolitan area and I wanted to understand where home values had grown the most in the past, it was generally close near kind of the job centers, because you had this greater concentration of people flowing into an area. It was hard to add housing into those areas because of just all sorts of things, so land use restrictions and kind of different barriers there. And that caused home values and rents near job centers to increase, and we find generally lower income households and often communities of color or individuals of color are then pushed further and further out. So then commutes increase, generally other amenities in that space. From my earlier testimony kind of highlights there's disparate access there. So for sure, this is kind of a common dynamic, and it comes down to many factors that influence that development.
Thank you for that. And Ms. Johnson, are there any particular impacts gentrification with displacement is having on the LGBTQ community?
Thank you for your question. The reality is that LGBTQ people, especially queer women, transgender people, and LGBTQ people of color are more likely to live in poverty and are more likely to be incarcerated. So, for example, up to 40% of women in incarceration identify as LGBTQ. So when we're looking at gaps, right, and we're looking at gentrification, when people who are re-entering society after imprisonment can't find stable housing, they're forced out of the community, right? And so that's just one example of how it does, where those intersections come together and affect the LGBTQ
And thank
community.
you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I thank all of you for being here today. Secretary Carson asked for comments to change the Obama administration's affirmative furthering fair housing regulation. This was not an arbitrary decision. President Obama's own Council of Economic Advisors had doubts that the way the regulation was written could effectively combat discrimination in the housing market. So, Dr. Firth, can you explain the shortcomings of the previous administration's affirmative furthering fair housing regulation? And in addition, was there a consensus when this rule was introduced back in 2015 that this would end discrimination?
Thank you so much. So in my view, it was a well-intentioned rule, and it had two primary shortcomings. So the first is that it was very costly to administer, particularly for small communities. So if you don't have a dedicated planning staff, you're going to be looking at paying a consultant $50,000 to complete an assessment of fair housing. And if you're the type of community that is inclusive and isn't putting up barriers to housing, that seems like punishing someone just for showing up and wanting to participate in HUD's program. And I don't think it makes sense to kind of push these communities through a process which might be helpful to some, but is costly for virtually everyone. And it turned out to be very costly for HUD's staff. They did it for a year and a half, and the staff, the career staff said, you know, we're exhausted. We can't keep up the pace of this with running through all of our communities. So that was the first shortcoming. The second was, despite the good intentions and the ample amount of work by many parties that went into it, it didn't change policy. So it shined some lights on problems, and it was certainly much better than the analysis of impediments as a research method. And you know, as a researcher, sort of I appreciate people working hard to understand problems and documenting things really carefully. And it's great if HUD wants to make information available to communities that they don't have the resources to study this data themselves. But if you're going to do all that work, there should be some change, right? So you look in the mirror and you walk away and you don't change anything. That's a fundamental flaw. And so I think that the rule can be improved without, you know, abandoning it or giving up on the idea that HUD can interact this way with municipalities. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. The economy is currently firing on all cylinders, I would say, and there are more job openings than people to fill them. Wage growth came in at 3.2 last year, which is the highest number in over a decade, and unemployment is at 3.8%. So capitalism really is an amazing thing. So, Dr. Olson, would you agree to me? Are you a capitalist?
Well, I'm an economist. Like many in my profession, I believe that perfect free markets are a gorgeous, beautiful thing. But also as an economist, I recognize that there are common market failures, such as information asymmetries, positive and negative externalities, and concentrated market power. If these are operating in a market to a strong degree, then the market will either over or underproduce that good.
Okay, let me ask you a question. In your testimony, there is a graph on home ownership between different races of individuals.
Yeah.
What do you believe is the biggest contributing factor for all these disparities, even though, as Federal Reserve Chairman Jay Powell stated in front of this committee in February, the economy is in a very healthy place?
Well, that's, I think, one of the upsetting parts about this, and why, you know, affirmatively was a part of the wording here, is that that has roots in historical policies that come back to redlining. If you can kind of imagine how home ownership kind of reinforces itself over time, you know, the biggest barrier to home ownership is that down payment. In order to make that down payment, people often turn to their communities, their families and friends for a loan or a gift. So for example, currently a first-time home buyer, you know, 51% of first-time home buyers need that kind of assistance from their communities. Back then it was probably similar. If you didn't get that resource over time, you can't make home ownership work. So if I start from a situation where we had redline areas, communities of color that were barred from access to home ownership, that would have a chain reaction that flowed all the way down to today that would continue that barrier.
Okay. I'm a capitalist, and who knows that and knows that free markets work. So Dr. Firth, before I continue this question, are you a capitalist?
Sure.
As a small business owner, and I have seen the effects of the government policies, the car industry, for example, if interest rates go up, it could keep somebody from buying. $50 a month could change their ability to buy a car. So can you give us quickly some specific examples of policies that are preventing the free market from being with affordable housing?
So a great one is parking minimums in big cities.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, who is also the chair for the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I especially thank you for the opportunity for us to move from talking points with reference to invidious discrimination to action items. We have several pieces of legislation that will afford us the opportunity to do so. I am going to call to your attention H.R. 149, which is the Housing Fairness Act. Very simply put, it seeks to codify and standardize two programs into one, the Fair Housing Initiative Program and the Fair Housing Assistance Program. In so doing, it will legitimize further, to a greater extent, the process of testing, a process that is utilized to acquire empirical evidence to support discrimination contentions. We can now, with this evidence, have facts that we can utilize to go forward. So, Ms. Goldberg, let me start with you, if I may. Could you kindly tell me whether testing can be beneficial if we do it on a standardized, nationwide basis, wherein the testers themselves have been trained to do so with a greater degree of expertise?
Absolutely. Testing is a critical tool for fair housing enforcement, and I'm sure Ms. Hill could talk to this as well. It's been used by our organization and many other organizations around the country. It's been upheld by the Supreme Court as a valid and necessary tool for fair housing enforcement because it lets you run essentially a controlled experiment, right? You send out two people who look the same in all relevant characteristics, but one is, for example, African American, one is white, one is a woman, one is a man, one is a family with kids, one without. And you give them comparable characteristics, comparable profile, so that they appear to be equally qualified. In fact, usually the tester who is a member of a protected class is a little bit better qualified than the other. And you see what happens to them. And if they are treated differently, because they are comparable in all relevant criteria, you can determine whether the difference in treatment is based on that protected class characteristic. No other way, no other tool that we have is so valuable for figuring out whether discrimination is occurring.
Would someone else care to give a comment?
I would, if I may.
Thank you.
Thank you. I very much appreciate it. What I'll mention is that testing is oftentimes the only way to discover whether discrimination is happening and whether people are being kept out of a certain community. We were able to bring litigation because we had analyzed some census data with regard to a community in the suburbs of New Orleans, and we found that the area surrounding one particular neighborhood was very racially mixed, but on the census data map, this certain community was very white, and when we zeroed in, we found that it was a large multi-block apartment complex. And there were no people of color living there. We'd sent some testers out, and all of the black testers were denied. Now, the property manager was very nice about it. She didn't say they couldn't have access to that space because they were black, but that's what was happening. When we got into litigation, the property manager who'd been managing that space for 32 years admitted under oath that in 32 years she had never rented to an African-American resident. And so we know that for decades, black people were excluded from this community where many of them had hoped to live. Without testing, we would not have been able to uncover that discrimination because nobody came in and made a complaint to us about that particular place.
Moving on to some statistical information that staff has done a great job. I want to compliment staff. Indication is that 71% of the reported housing discrimination complaints have been handled by the Fair Housing Initiative Program, and this is in 2017. And that the Fair Housing Assistance Program handled 23%, that HUD handled 4.5%, and the DOJ 0.1%. These numbers seem to indicate that the Fair Housing Initiative Program, which is an NGO-based program, and the Fair Housing Assistance Program, these two entities seem to be handling the lion's share of these complaints. Ms. Goldberg, has that been your experience?
Yes, I think that pattern has held true over quite a long time.
And finally, let me just close with a word. I hear many people rail and complain about invidious discrimination, perhaps not in the terminology that I've just utilized, but they do. They complain, but when given the opportunity to do something about it, they don't seem to have the energy to be kind, to do so. I think that this is a great opportunity for us to go from talking points about invidious discrimination to action items. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Hill, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the chair. Appreciate this good hearing today and appreciate the witnesses being before us. I've been involved in around the housing policy area for a long, long time. I was a young staffer back in the 80s on the Senate Housing Subcommittee, so I certainly am familiar with the legacy of some of these challenges that we talk about today. And Ms. Hill, thank you for your work in South Louisiana. I was a volunteer with Rotary International, and we rebuilt about 60 houses in Lacombe after Katrina, using Bush-Clinton Katrina money, and that's why I'm so supportive of Al Green and Ann Wagner's efforts at CDBG DF reform. I know it's controversial in the Congress, but we saw families be given the money to raise their homes in Lacombe, which is on the north side of Lake Pontchartrain, unincorporated area, and the money didn't go into raising their homes. So they'll be just back in the same situation, you know, in a future high water event along Lake Pontchartrain, and that's why the after action auditing there shows almost $800 million was allocated through CDBG DF, but was not spent properly for home raising. And so that's why we really need reforms in that area to make sure that money gets to the homeowners, is spent by the homeowners for the purpose that it was intended, so that they have a much safer, drier place in the future. So thanks for your work. I was intrigued listening to the conversation back and forth about HUD's discoveries at Facebook, and we're in a new era of discrimination when we go digital and go social media. So that was interesting to me. The chair and the ranking member have been talking about forming a task force of this committee on financial technology, fintech, and of course Zillow's on the cutting edge of fintech, as well as Facebook. So I'm very interested in not only how we can cut compliance costs for market participants, improve access to the unbanked and things of that nature through fintech, but also sort out at a lower cost discrimination through the use of big data. So to help me learn a little bit more about this, who wants to answer the question, how did HUD learn about this Facebook ad presentation issue? Who's the best one? Ms. Goldberg, should you tackle that?
I believe HUD learned about it the same way we did, which was through some amazing investigative reporting done by ProPublica. Okay, good. And once that was identified, what was the methodology then for tracking that and discovering it? And is that open source type data that could be used by a financial institution, for example? Or tell me how then HUD went on to the next level to build the case, if you will. So I can't speak to what HUD has done. It has issued a charge which tells you what it found, but I'm not sure what its methodology was. I can tell you what we did, if that would be of interest, which is that we created, for the purposes of this test, what's the word that I want? A management company, right? And said to Facebook that we had apartments we wanted to rent. We went on their site, to their ad portal, and looked at the characteristics that they let us use to either include people who would see that ad or to exclude people who would not see that ad. We were able to get ads approved by Facebook that included the use, either to exclude people and primarily, included the use of protected categories under the Fair Housing Act. And so it was a form of testing in a way, right? We were able to see for ourselves, by posing as a potential landlord, that the tools that Facebook made available enabled us to discriminate.
Well, as we proceed on looking at, and Dr. Olson, do you want to add to that just from Zillow's point of view of looking at big data? Do you have any thoughts on that, on how best to, for HUD, for example, to root out that kind of look using media, social media, or big data?
I don't think we have. As an economist at Zillow, don't have a lot of insight into kind of what HUD could do in order to explore. I can say that Zillow and the service that it offers in order to really make it the purpose of it at the founding was to solve for information asymmetries by putting all available listings online for everyone to search and sort through. And that kind of founding is important to this kind of idea.
Thank you, Chair. I'll yield back.
The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Foster, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for this hearing. You know, I represent the second, third, and fourth largest city in Illinois, Joliet, Aurora, and Naperville. And they're rolling through here on the screens are these redlining pictures. And I remember trembling with rage when I saw the redlining pictures of Joliet and Aurora from the 1930s. And then driving through those neighborhoods and see how their futures had been determined by this, you know, bigoted, racist set of policies. I also represent Naperville, which until well into the 20th century was what was called a sundown town. So they didn't have any redlining issues there. But it's gotten better. It's really gotten better in Joliet, in Naperville, in Aurora. And a big part of that were the federal policies that leaned heavily against this. And you know, I was reading through the Facebook, the complaint against Facebook, which sort of brought that same level of rage. I don't think this was intentional, but it just underlines the danger in the power that's been given these companies. That although Facebook themselves probably didn't deliberately do this, I am convinced there are many landlords out there that would take advantage of the ability to do that. And it underlines, you know, the fact that Congress hasn't been paying enough attention to the power of tech on this. But then on the other side, it's how, you know, what could you do to actually fix this and use the power of tech for a positive way? I guess Ms. Goldberg or Ms. Hill, I can't remember, was talking about doing electronic testing, you know, essentially simulating landlords. You could potentially, you know, have access to, you know, when someone puts out an ad, say, okay, that's fine, you set this criteria, but those criteria will discriminate against X, Y, and Z, and let the person, you know, thinking about putting that ad out there, get immediate feedback from Facebook that this is a discriminatory set of criteria that you have. And is Facebook, to your knowledge, talking about that sort of immediate feedback so that even, say, an individual landlord will not inadvertently do this?
So I can speak to that. What Facebook has done is committed to taking off of its platform, creating a new portal for people who want to advertise services related to housing, employment, and credit, so that they will create ads through a different mechanism than other people who are creating ads for other kinds of goods and services, and that employment and credit portal will not offer the options of any categories that you can either include or exclude that reflect.
But the number of proxies that you can generate
it's a lot. It's a lot, but and we will be working with them and monitoring what they do over the next 3 years to ensure that all of the categories that might have a discriminatory effect are removed. I would say, I think, two things, if I could, in response to your question further. One is that in the context of Facebook, the problem is not just in the ad creation to begin with. That was clear, and that's what some of the main provisions of our settlement agreement speak to. But a problem that neither we nor Facebook actually knows how to figure out, but we'll be looking at over the next 3 years, is the way that its algorithm delivers ads to people, even when those ads don't have any discriminatory targeting, based on the other information that Facebook has about people and who it thinks will be most likely to respond to an ad, right? And the other ad campaigns that may be running, which reflect the historic discrimination in our society. So it's a real problem. And we're hopeful that by working together, we'll be able to get to the bottom of it. I would just say, if I could, that I think the Facebook problem is a big one. And I hope that we're on a good path to tackling that. But it's not the only one. And the way we see algorithms and big data work, for example, in the mortgage lending space, is a little bit different. And so it's going to take a little bit different kind of tools to address that.
Yeah. Now, and then on the other side, you can imagine a situation, we spend a whole lot of money trying to subsidize socioeconomic integration in our communities. I mean, it's a really good thing. It's a better outcome for the whole community. And so have people ever thought about, we have all this big data, so that, for example, just paying, say, Facebook, if their ad results in a placement of a family in a neighborhood which increases socioeconomic integration, that somehow, you know, they get rewarded for that monetarily. Is that sort of idea ever been talked about, to just use these big data sets for good? If you could answer that for the record, I'd appreciate it. Yield back.
The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for convening the hearing today. And I also want to thank the witnesses for appearing this morning. Dr. Firth, if I could, for you, in your testimony, especially in your written testimony, you go into some discussion about community development block grants. We all know that the Community Development Block Grant Program is one of the oldest programs under HUD. It's also, frankly, probably one of the most popular with our local mayors and local elected officials. In your written testimony, you discussed withholding some of these CDBG funding to encourage, if you will, local communities to better incentivize fair and equal housing access. Can you explain, if you could, why withholding these CDBG funds from communities would in fact better incentivize better housing and land use policies?
Certainly, thank you. So CDBG money is not a big part of any community's budget unless they're in the disaster program. But it's a very popular part because every mayor kind of gets this little pool of money, it's often like $1 million, to do a project that they don't have local budget for. So this isn't usually used to just pay for standard things, it's used to pay for kind of really fun one-offs. It is unfortunately frequently used to directly give to local businesses, which seems like a really, really poor use of federal money to me. And so mayors love it, right? It gives them a ribbon cutting, it gives them something that they couldn't have gotten through, you know, the local taxing authority that their voters wouldn't necessarily have approved. And so that is a great lever. It doesn't hurt renters, right? So if we said, okay, you know, if you don't comply with some, you know, inclusion, we're gonna withhold your home funds. Well, the home funds actually support low-income renters. So the pain there is felt by the people we're trying to help. CDBG hurts mayors if you take that away. That is I joke that it's a French abbreviation for Mayor's Ribbon Cutting Slush Fund. And I think that's how it often gets used, and that's why it is a good lever, although it doesn't hit every community.
If I could follow up on CDBG, and I didn't state this to the witnesses before. In my district, I represent West Tennessee, so I've got part of Memphis, part of the city of Memphis, city of Jackson, Dyersburg, and rural parts of West Tennessee. Memphis is a community that uses CDBG grants quite a bit. As it relates to the formula, and I know I'm getting a little bit in the weeds, but the Formula B, if I could, which in part is based on, as I understand it, 1940s housing data or 1940s data is weighted at around a 50% appropriation. So some older suburbs benefit from the pre-1940 or the 1940 formula, even though they're kind of low-need communities. So my bottom line question is, should HUD look at redoing the formula, reformulating it in order to better distribute funds?
Yes, well, HUD can't, but I would urge this committee to revisit the formulas. They were written in the 1970s when an old house was a bad house, right? So the assumption in the formula was that if you lived in a 50-year-old house, it must be falling apart. And now we know if we go to the most exclusive addresses and zip codes, the houses are often very old and very, very nice. And that's no longer a good proxy for need. So I think we could, very easily rewrite the formula to much better target Congress's original intent and what this Congress would also intend for use in that program. I would applaud that.
And you think it's something that can be done and could be done during this Congress?
Well, every other Congress since then has not wanted to touch it because, you know, there's a fixed pot of money, and if a little less goes to Brookline, Massachusetts to go, you know, instead going to Memphis or Allentown, then, you know, somebody squeals, and, you know, the people who squeal have representatives in this body, and it's going to, redistributing money across cities is going to hurt somebody. But if we can put aside that parochialism, or even say within your district that there are communities that are really well resourced and there are communities that aren't. And right now, even within your district, we're probably funneling that money poorly.
Thank you, Dr. Firth, and I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from Washington, Mr. Heck, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Indeed, thank you for holding a hearing on a matter as important as this is. Dr. Olson, welcome to Washington, D.C. Again, I think as an economist, I have some questions I'd like to ask you, specifically following up on Mr. Clay's questions regarding gentrification, which I thought were fascinating and provocative. And Ms. Hill, thank you so much for reminding me that gentrification can occur for reasons other than just lack of supply, i.e. flight to higher ground. That was a paradigm-shifting reminder for me, and I appreciate it very much. But Dr. Olson, is it not only obvious that discrimination occurs everywhere, but with respect to gentrification, is it also true that it can often be especially propelled by supply considerations?
Yeah, yes, definitely, of course. When we think about displacement, you know, what's happening is demand is overwhelming supply. And the current way that, you know, we upzone, or rather do not upzone.
We've had that conversation.
We've had that conversation before, yeah. It definitely exacerbates this problem and has barriers to kind of successful or affluent communities.
So in a community like Seattle, for example, where in particular high-tech companies like Google and Facebook and Zillow and, of course, Amazon bring in not just thousands but tens of thousands of people, it creates a supply problem on the housing side, leading to gentrification.
Yeah.
And gentrification has multiple and insidious effects on people of color, does it not? They are pushed out of homes that they no longer could afford, leaving them then to confront secondarily, where am I going to live when I am confronted with additional discriminatory barriers? Is that a fair statement?
Something that I often say when I'm talking to groups, you know, around the country about housing supply and land use is to say, in one way or another, your community is going to change. If the housing stock does not evolve, if you do not allow it to evolve or become more dense, then the people that live there, the makeup of them, what they look like, the kind of jobs they have, is going to become, that's what's going to change, right? You're going to have people with lower incomes moving out. If you allow the built environment to change, then it's more likely that the diversity within the set of people.
So there are two dimensions to this that I want to quickly introduce and get your reaction to as it relates to the gentrification or supply in general.
Sure.
It seems to me that when demand exceeds supply, you basically have given additional power to landlords over tenants. That if they have a product that is in short supply, you have in fact tilted a little bit of the power equation, which then represents yet another way in which people who are traditionally discriminated against have even less leverage, as it were. Is that not just basic economic common sense?
Yeah, I think a way to make that more tangible is to say, in an environment where demand is overwhelming supply, and I have an open listing, say, 5 people show up at the exact same time, I get to choose which one.
So finally, and this is the one that on some level bothers me the most. Homeownership in this country has declined, and it's its relative lowest level in quite some time. We know that people of color are discriminated against with respect to lending and with respect to purchasing. But given that home ownership, which still is aspired to by the overwhelming percent of Americans, is the single largest net worth building tool at their avail. The single largest net worth building asset to the average American is home ownership. Then discrimination, when it occurs as a consequence of all these factors, has an especially long-term structural debilitating economic effect. Does it not, Dr. Olson?
Yes, I think homeownership is one of the biggest ways that you have intergenerational transfers of wealth, and then for yourself to also build wealth over time.
And supply plays an important consideration in all that. Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Barr, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today on the very important subject of fair housing. I want to talk a little bit about disparate impact. The Supreme Court's decision in inclusive communities held that, quote, disparate impact liability must be limited so employers and other regulated entities are able to make the practical business choices and profit-related decisions that sustain a vibrant and dynamic free enterprise system, unquote. But the 2013 version of the HUD rule required defendants to prove that the practice at issue was, quote, necessary to achieve one or more substantial, legitimate, non-discriminatory interests of the respondent or defendant, unquote. Dr. Firth, this question is for you. Did the 2013 version of the HUD regulation have the effect of discouraging these employers and regulated entities from making practical business decisions out of fear that they might result in a lawsuit, notwithstanding otherwise being perfectly legitimate and good faith decisions?
I apologize, Representative. I have no expertise in that area.
Dr. Olson, do you have a view on that?
Yeah. Also, I don't think I can comment with my expertise.
Do any of the other witnesses have an opinion about that?
So I can speak to it, not in the employment context, but as a fair housing advocate and a civil rights attorney who has litigated these cases. What I can say, as someone who runs a fair housing advocacy group, that we have used the disparate impact theory to positively benefit the residents of South Louisiana, most recently in the direct aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, where we brought litigation against a local government, a community that passed a law that would require that homeowners who wanted to rent their homes in their community could only rent to people who were related to them by blood. At the time, census data proved that 93% of the homeowners in that parish were white. It would directly follow then that the majority of their blood relatives were white. And so even though that law did not on its face exclude people of color, it had the effect of prohibiting people of color from renting in that community.
So I want to maybe ask the question a little bit differently to get at the question that I'm concerned about. The Supreme Court in the Inclusive Communities case, what the Supreme Court held was that a disparate impact claim cannot be based solely upon a showing of statistical disparity. Given that the HUD rule on disparate impact does not conform, I'm talking about the 2013 rule, given that that regulation does not conform with the Supreme Court decision in 2015, shouldn't we agree that a revised rulemaking is appropriate? Dr. Firth?
So I can't speak to your premise, but clearly if the rule is ruled unconstitutional, then it must be revised.
Right, and so HUD has released a proposed revised rule that conforms to the Supreme Court Inclusive Communities decision. Does anybody have a problem with that?
Well, I would just say that I don't believe that the Inclusive Communities decision spoke to the 2013 HUD rule, and I don't believe that there's been any court finding that the HUD 2013 rule is unlawful.
Well, and to the contrary, courts have found that there is no conflict between the 2013 rule and the ICP case decision. And based on that, there's no reason to go back and revisit this issue, which is a rule that has been in effect, or excuse me, a doctrine that has been in place, a tool that has been available to us almost as long as the Fair Housing Act, has been upheld by all the federal circuit courts that have...
Reclaiming my time, and I apologize to cut you off because I know you're making a point, but in my remaining time, what I'm concerned about is that the 2013 rule may be well-intentioned, but the concern that I have is that it would actually have the unintended effect of reducing access for the very classes that the Fair Housing Act is trying to protect, because it's going to encourage housing providers just simply to withdraw for fear of litigation. And so I think when we talk about an inadequate supply of housing and the negative impacts that has on vulnerable communities, we need to be very, very careful about HUD regulations that would create a litigious environment that would discourage the provision of housing.
So can I just say that the 2013 rule did not change the landscape in any significant way compared to what it had been for many decades before that, and we have not seen a withdrawal of landlords from the market in fear of litigation. So I think that your concern is unfounded.
My experience is different. I yield back.
The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Lawson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome to the committee. Ms. Johnson, I was very interested in your presentation, and I know it's been 50 years since the Fair Housing Act was implemented a couple of days in 1968 after Martin Luther King's assassination. And I would like for you to elaborate a little bit more on access, for the LGBTQ community of projects that are funded by HUD. Because according to this information is that there was a final rule in 2016 about access, and then it was alleviated in 2017. Could you express a little bit more from your presentation what kind of effect that this has had on the LGBTQ community?
Sure, thank you so much for your question. I think what is, for me from this conversation, what is so important is in the conversation about Facebook and the conversations that we've had, is that this is about ending systemic discrimination. And what we're seeing, how LGBTQ people are impacted, is that they are people of color. They are people living with disabilities. They are coming from and returning citizens from prison. And overwhelmingly, we're seeing these kinds of this kind of discrimination impacting young. Again, I said in my presentation, 40% of young people living in homelessness are LGBTQ people. So there was a statement about the importance of owning a home, right, and the barriers, right, the discriminatory barriers to that. But there are discriminatory barriers to renting homes, to homeless shelters, right? So multiple levels, right, of discrimination before these young people or couples, families can even get to a place of owning a home. So I think it's important, right, that in addition to what has happened since 1968, right, we've seen gender added, we've seen familial status added, but we've got more work to do, right? We need, in addition to doing the testing around current protected statuses, we also need to be expanding who the protected classes are, or reaffirming who those protected classes are, which again, around sexual orientation, around people returning from prison, around people who have housing vouchers. we've made a lot of advances, but there's just, I think it's important for Congress to continue its work to recognize that discrimination is still present. We have to acknowledge it, and we have to continue to do our due diligence, or this affirming work, to name it, to find it, and to prevent gaps in the law for creating, allowing for that kind of discrimination.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Hill, how have credit scores discriminated against people trying to enter the housing market?
Well, I think it's clear that there is a problem. There are gaps in access, and the National Fair Housing Alliance has actually taken the lead on bringing this conversation to the forefront nationally. We know that people in communities of color are underbanked and oftentimes refer on the subprime lending market. And so there are a variety of ways in which access to credit leads to discriminatory outcomes. The credit scoring system and the algorithms that are used, as we talk more about this conversation around data, definitely does have some discriminatory impacts on communities of color.
Ms. Goldberg, I got a few more seconds. Can you comment on that too, please?
Absolutely. One of the problems that we see is that the credit scoring systems that are used depend on the results of our many, many decades worth of segregated and discriminatory patterns. And so the access that people of color in particular have had to mainstream credit from banks and savings and loans that looks good on your credit record, that boosts your credit score, has been limited. And instead, folks have been relegated to the fringe market with payday lenders and subprime lenders and title lenders, et cetera, who don't report positive payment history to the credit bureaus, but do report if you fail to pay. And so your good payment history doesn't work for you, but your bad payment history, should that happen, works against you. And that's one of the things that's gotten baked into the system.
The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Stivers, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this important hearing, and I'd like to thank the witnesses for being here. My first question is to Dr. Firth. I represent, among other places, Franklin County, Ohio, Columbus, Ohio, where we have a shortage of about 50,000 affordable housing units at this point, and that shortage seems to be getting worse. Would any of these bills, do you think, help us create a supply that would fix that backlog?
So the brief reading of the bills that were introduced ahead of this hearing, I saw lots of valuable and well-intentioned things, but I don't think any of them would help increase supply.
I actually agree, and I think that's our biggest problem, that and affordability. Dr. Olson, I want to take off on some questions that the gentleman from Missouri and the gentleman from Washington asked about gentrification. And I'm curious if maybe our passion and upset feelings on gentrification might be slightly misplaced. Let me just ask you a couple questions. Does gentrification help renters or homeowners?
I think one of the reasons, and if I can...
No, can you just answer the question? I don't have a lot of time, ma'am. Does it help renters or homeowners? Do property values go up or down when you have gentrification?
I think you first have to define what you mean by the word gentrification.
That's, other people have described gentrification. Do property values go up or down during gentrification? If you can't answer it, we can move on.
We can move on.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I do have one more question for you, Dr. Olson. So you testified that minority homeowners have more frustrations with their home searches. Can you describe what those frustrations are related to?
I can describe what the exact questions that we asked. So such questions are: for full satisfaction with the home search process, we asked about finding the right agent is very difficult or difficult. We know about the number of offers they submit in order to win a bid on a home during a for-sale process, as well as the number of rent applications they need to submit. We also asked about perceptions of discrimination. So do you feel that you have been treated differently due to, and we asked questions about race, sexual orientation, Section 8 voucher holding, religion, veteran status, gender identity, and gender itself. In all of those questions, you can see a consistent pattern where people of color and other protected classes generally have more frustrations in that part of the search process.
Do you think any of these bills would alleviate some of those frustrations, and how so?
As an economist who studies housing markets broadly, I don't have a lot of good insight into the specifics of policy.
Okay, no problem. Ms. Johnson, you had brought up earlier the issue of homelessness, and I know a lot of folks in the LGBT community face homelessness, and one of the things that you may be surprised to know is that the Housing and Urban Development Department does not include anyone who's under age 18 in their definition of homelessness. Do you think if they would change that definition to include folks under 18, it would help people in the LGBT community?
Can you hear me?
I can now.
Can you hear me now? I think recognizing homelessness of all folks, in particular, again, yes, under 18, I think that's an important focus in the community. And I also think it's important for us to really look at, right, like what is offered in these shelters, right? Like what is offered in renting for these young people as well. I think it could potentially be helpful.
Thank you. And one last question, Dr. Firth. Under the policy proposal that to use CDBG grants to incentivize community behavior, what metric would you use to evaluate whether a community is excessively exclusionary? Thank you, sorry.
Thank you. I don't think one metric is going to be sufficient. We have to look at a bunch of things. Rent, the level of rent is probably primary, and then within that, if you're a high rent place, is rent growing even higher, and are you issuing building permits? Those are key. Do you have a record of judgments against you in discriminatory legal actions? Is something that I would certainly include. So I think that to be careful, and I've run the numbers a few times on different things, to be careful, you need to have a multiple element definition.
If you want to expand on that, if you could submit it for the record, if you want to include any of those elements, that would be very helpful to this committee, I believe. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have some questions, particularly when we see how redlining functioned. It was, in many ways, and as we know now, a very racially targeted policy, but it was kind of coded into an economic language and an economic policy. So it was racially targeted, but it was economic in its implementation. And so, you know, in having that result, as you had mentioned, Dr. Olson, that it created a situation where some communities were more accessible to investment than others, and that has had intergenerational consequences. So would you say that the practice of redlining and making some communities with different racial makeups more able to easily access capital and lending contribute to a racial wealth gap today?
Yeah, I think if I understand, so let me break it apart into two parts. So one, when they redlined, they did look at kind of contextual element. You know, this has a school, this has parks, but it was pretty explicit too. Like there are people of color here, and there are immigrants here, and so it got a lower rating, and so hazardous for lending. I think to your maybe one of the ways that I can get at kind of looking at your question, if like, could you, for example, change some of the ways that you access credit or maybe measure credit scores so that you can make this more balanced and provide more credit to people of color that could, lay kind of not resolve because we have a long road ahead of us in order to fix these problems. So for example, one of the barriers to having a good credit score, access to credit, is that these, regularly paying your rent on time, regularly paying utility bills, regularly paying a cell phone bill Those are not currently included in standardized measures of credit scores. Let's say you did, then you could balance it back.
So just to reclaim my time very quickly, so would you say that government policy, particularly centered around redlining, has contributed to the racial wealth gap?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, yes, yes. Yeah.
I have a question. So we now have this problem where there's an enormous racial wealth gap as a consequence of discriminatory public policy. I'm curious to see if there are other policies or other practices that, whether intentionally or unintentionally, are kind of this economically coded yet discriminatory or compounding policies. So in New York City, we have a really big issue with predatory equity. It's a practice whereby real estate speculators spend exorbitant sums to buy up affordable housing all over New York. The buildings that are bought come at risk of defaulting, and tens of thousands of families stand to lose their homes, in addition to tens of thousands of affordable apartments. Ms. Goldberg, I have a quick question. We're seeing in my home district of Queens that landlords are using harassment tactics to push tenants of color, immigrants, and others out of rent-stabilized buildings using overcharges on keys, rewriting leases, illegally raising rents, refusing to make repairs, fraudulent major capital improvements, and even turning off the heat during winter. What is the Fair Housing Act's role in mitigating a problem happening on this scale?
So the Fair Housing Act may be one tool. I suspect other tools are also needed. But if what is happening is affecting people of color, families with kids, people with disabilities, members of protected classes disproportionately, then the disparate impact rule under the Fair Housing Act can be a tool to force the landlords to change their practices.
So we can use the disparate impact rule to highlight some of these practices. What about what we're seeing here is I represent one of the densest immigrant communities in the country. And what we're also seeing is that landlords are leveraging a tenant's immigration status as a way to exploit money out of them. Sometimes they will increase their security deposits and say, you need to give me another $300 or I'm going to report you to ICE. What under the Fair Housing Act can we use to make sure that things like that don't happen?
So Ms. Hill might also weigh in on this, but I would suspect that you could show that that would be discrimination based on national origin, which is a protected class under the Fair Housing Act.
Thank you. Ms. Hill, do you have any?
I would agree with that in the interest of time.
Thank you very much. I yield my time.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Steyler, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for being here and testifying. I look at a lot of our housing and think, where are there areas where we can drive the cost down? In particular, we see onerous local restrictions becoming a major macroeconomic concern across the United States. And Dr. Farth, in your testimony, I thought you thoughtfully pointed out some of the restrictions that are in place. You identified Silicon Valley, saying it has a smaller proportion of the United States population in 1990 than today, heavily based on local zoning and restrictions. And you see these impacts in areas where we have a high cost of housing, which seems to correlate with some of our other discussions here on homelessness in particular. In the heavy-handed regulations, in particular in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York City, have a significant impact on our overall economy. Can you comment and quantify some of those impacts?
So I've seen 3 good macroeconomic papers that quantify the total impact of regulation in our kind of most regulated, high-wage coastal cities. And those impacts range from something like our GDP would be 1 or 2% larger, so that's overall U.S. income would be 1 or 2% larger if those cities instead had average levels of regulation. And then the most, I don't know if it's optimistic or pessimistic, says it'd be more like 9 or 10% larger. And I think it's also important to note, most of that GDP gain would be going to people who are currently excluded from those job markets. So we should think of cities of metro areas as fundamentally about job access, right? People move to places, apart from some retirees, primarily because they want to work there. And when you say, oh, if you want to work in Silicon Valley, you need to be able to drop 1.4, 1.5 million on a starter home, you're excluding most people with middle skill levels from accessing those great job opportunities.
So you're identifying who it would hurt. The corollary of that, right, is who's it helping then? Who are these local restrictions benefiting?
So you really benefit if you were lucky enough to buy a home in one of these elite districts in 1960 or 1970. If you were, sitting on that, especially in California, where a state tax law prevents taxes from growing for longstanding homeowners, the sort of the home voter, the person who's in their house and is like, I have got it made and I don't want anybody else to come in and mess this up, they are the primary beneficiaries of the exclusion.
Thank you. I want to jump over into your proposed test as we look at your proposed replacement of some of the fair housing, and in particular in the market test. You drive into outcomes rather than inputs. Right. In particular, you're looking at how do we analyze potential rent decline, giving more people access to affordable housing. Could you comment on that test?
Yeah, so if you're a community, say you're in a really expensive metro area, rent is going to be high, right? So let's say that Mountain View, California decided we're going to be the YIMBY capital of Silicon Valley. We're going to build like crazy and have a huge diverse housing stock. Rent would still be high because it's in a very expensive metro area. But you'd probably see rent starting to decline in that area. We see this already in DC, where I live, where in the Navy Yard and H Street, where there's been extensive building, rent has fallen and vacancies have gone up, and that changes, as Dr. Olson said, the balance of power between landlords and tenants. The best tool you have in your hand when you go to talk to a landlord is if their unit is vacant and they don't have somebody else to rent it.
I appreciate you taking the time to examine where these outputs are and how we would measure declining rents and bringing people in. I appreciate your testimony today. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from North Carolina, Ms. Adams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the Congresswoman for putting this together. Thank you all for your testimony. Fair housing and affordable housing is a particularly concerning issue for my district, 12th District in Charlotte. Getting a lot of people in, we've got a lot of buildings going up, and nobody can afford to live in them. But let me ask you about the NIMBYism question, and I want to direct this to Ms. Hill because of your background as an attorney. Everybody supports fair and affordable housing as long as it's not in my backyard. So wealthier, more affluent communities understand oftentimes how to manipulate the zoning laws and prevent rezoning efforts in their neighborhoods. It's also why the 2015 affirmatively furthered fair housing rule was so important. What do could you speak to how HUD's rollback of fair housing regulations will allow NIMBY policies to continue to maintain segregated housing in many of our communities?
Absolutely. I think without the planning process that requires local governments to ensure that people have equal access to communities, then we will continue to see exclusionary actions by communities that are opposed to people of color as well as lower income residents moving in. In New Orleans, we find, as we've been talking here today about income-based segregation, we are actually dealing, again, as someone on the ground doing this work every day, we are dealing in that community with not just income-based segregation, but entrenched, deep racial segregation. We know that after Hurricane Katrina, Black renters in South Louisiana found that the same communities that provided working class whites with an affordable suburban housing alternative, as well as an exit strategy to avoid school integration, went to great lengths to ban or restrict rental housing in their neighborhoods. Wow. So income-based segregation is not necessarily the problem that we face. It is still deeply entrenched racial segregation, and NIMBYism does perpetuate that.
Yes. Ms. Goldberg, would you like to respond?
I think Ms. Hill said it all.
Okay, let me move to Ms. Johnson. There's been a lot of interest, obviously, from this committee in the LGBTQ community. I have a very large community in my district, too. So let me ask about the housing protections that we already have do apply to homeless shelters and services for people who are experiencing homelessness that receive federal funds. So in your opinion, are the protections adequate to ensure that the LGBTQ people can get shelter and services when they're experiencing homelessness? Why or why not?
Thank you so much for your question, Congresswoman. The short answer is no. Unfortunately not. As we highlighted in the written testimony, LGBTQ people, and especially transgender people, are often turned away from shelter services altogether. And enforcement of the protections, while this policy exists, the enforcement is so often inconsistent. And frankly, many LGBTQ people are fearful to even file a complaint against a service provider because they have a fear that they won't get services again. And so again, like we were saying, it's important to have a policy, but the enforcement of those policies is critical.
Thank you. Ms. Goldberg, redlining, and we've talked a lot about it. Does it continue to manifest in other ways? You've talked about some of them in terms of the practice. It appears that it has not ended. So are there other ways that it continues to manifest itself?
It does seem to continue in multiple forms, doesn't it? So, I mean, we still see kind of your garden variety discrimination that keeps people of color out of other communities, out of white communities or integrated communities, because real estate agents won't show them houses there and things like that, right? So you've got that. But some of the ways that the advertising for housing works, as we talked about in relation to our Facebook case and others, and particularly some of the ways that we've touched on a little bit in the hearing today about the kind of economic legacy of segregation and what that means for the kinds of financial services that people of color use as compared to whites, continues to disadvantage people in their search for a mortgage.
Thank you, ma'am. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney, who is also the chair of our Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I thank my friend for yielding, and I apologize to my colleagues that I was in another hearing and could not be here for a lot of the important discussion on this critically important topic. My first question is for Ms. Goldberg. As you know, one of the most important aspects of the Fair Housing Act is that it allows for so-called disparate impact claims, which prohibits practices that have, and I quote, disproportionately adverse effects on minorities, end quote, and can't be justified by any other legitimate rationale. So this allows us to root out unconscious bias, or even bias that is unconscious but well hidden. I've signed multiple amicus briefs supporting the use of disparate impact claims. And in fact, the Supreme Court explicitly upheld disparate impact claims under the Fair Housing Act in 2015. But now the Trump administration is reportedly trying to weaken the disparate impact rule. And we know that HUD has recently submitted proposed changes to this rule to OMB. Are you concerned that weakening HUD's disparate impact rule will allow clear housing discrimination to go unpunished?
Thank you for that question, Congresswoman. We are very concerned. As we've talked over the course of this hearing about many different ways that disparate impact has protected all sorts of people, from policies that appear neutral on their face but work to the disadvantage of members of protected classes. And that kind of discrimination is every bit as harmful to the people who suffer from it as the more blatant kind of in-your-face, I'm not going to rent to you because of, plug in your characteristic there. So having access to this tool is enormously important in preserving the fair housing rights of people in this country. It is long established It has been supported by courts all across the country. It has had bipartisan support. As far as we can see, there is no good reason to go back to the drawing board and try to rewrite this rule altogether. In fact, there will be some real disruption, I think, and costs to industry to have to accommodate, changing to comply with a new rule. And it seems to be driven in part by some industry concerns. I would just say the insurance industry in particular has been trying for many, many years to get out from coverage under the Fair Housing Act and the disparate impact rule in particular.
Thank you. And Ms. Goldberg, while we know that there have been substantial technological shifts in the housing market, we don't know much about how these shifts are affecting fair housing enforcement. Is there currently a way to know how many fair housing complaints related to online platforms have been filed with HUD or other reporting agencies? And do you think HUD should report this data? And if it's not being collected, should we be collecting this data? And how would reporting this data to HUD help fair housing enforcement? And I think we know with all the changes, this is an important goal we need to look at.
Right. I do not believe that HUD collects information on fair housing complaints based on, online platforms. Given what we learned in our Facebook case, I think that it would be unlikely for people to know that they had not been shown an ad, because at least in the Facebook context, the way the platform operated meant that certain ads never got in front of certain people. And if you don't know that you've been discriminated against, you are unlikely to file a complaint. And I think that's a real challenge that we face and requires a different approach to enforcement.
Okay, and Ms. Johnson, you mentioned in your testimony the LGBTQ community experiences unusually high rates of homelessness. And what I found particularly troubling is the survey you cited, which found that nearly 1/3 of transgender people who tried to access a shelter were turned away due solely to their transgender status. You mentioned that HUD's Equal Access Rule, which was just finalized in 2016, is intended to ensure equal access to shelters for transgender people. So my question is HUD's Equal Access Rule working? Is it actually ensuring that transgender people have equal access to shelters? And if not, what can be done to strengthen this rule?
Thank you. Again, enforcement around, well, one, it's important, again, to say we have got to explicitly name sexual orientation as a protected class. We have to do it, and that's the first place that we can go. And so I just wanted to be really clear that we need to do that before enforcement, is to the degree it needs to be, can even happen. I think the other piece of this is that in addition to people who are turned away from shelters and the homelessness that they're receiving, is that because of homelessness, so many people are also incarcerated, and so we're also dealing with multiple forms of discrimination. So based on gender, sexual orientation, but often spurs into other types of discrimination.
Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning or good afternoon to all the panelists. We've heard how redlining and housing discrimination persists 50 years after the Fair Housing Act. And as an example, Latinos and African Americans are more than twice as likely as whites to be denied mortgage credit or fear that they'll be denied if they apply for a loan. This according to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health found that 1 out of 3 Latino adults reported having personally experienced discrimination when trying to rent a room or apartment or buy a house. Ms. Goldberg, I'd like to ask you a question. Your organization conducted an analysis of staffing at the Office of Fair Housing, and in 1994, there were about 740 staff people in that office. They've declined since then. As of 2018, the number of employees in that office is about 480, What funding and resource challenges do HUD officials face in enforcing the Fair Housing Act, Part 1, and Part 2 is, given the clear and significant challenges we face with housing discrimination, how can the Fair Housing Act be enforced if there's no one to enforce it?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. So I would agree that the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at HUD needs greater resources. It needs more people. It needs more training for its staff. It needs the kind of technological resources necessary to confront the challenges of the marketplace today. And all of that, I guess, in the bottom line comes down to money, and we would encourage more of that. I would also say that what we have seen and other members of the committee have alluded to is that the front lines of defense in this fight for fair housing really rests with organizations like Ms. Hill's and many others across the country that are in their community. They know their community. They're doing education in their community so people are aware of their rights and know what to do if they think their rights have been violated, and that, you know, help people through that process of vindicating their rights. And so more funding for the groups on the ground is also really critical to accomplishing that goal.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, at this point, I'd ask to enter a report from the Equal Rights Center 2013 report onto the record. Ms. Goldberg, continuing, can you describe the role of testing and how important it is in combating discrimination in housing?
Sure. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Testing is a vital tool to use to ferret out discriminatory practices, discriminatory behavior, because it lets you determine that whether or not, I should say, the protected characteristic of a person is the key factor in their lack of access. They're being denied for a unit, whether that's to buy a home, to rent a place, et cetera, et cetera. It really lets you control all of the factors in the equation except for their race or their national origin or the fact that they have kids or a disability. And without it, it would be very difficult in many cases to determine whether or not discrimination is happening.
Thank you. One last question. Recently, BuzzFeed reported December 14, 2018, that loan officers at banks were instructed by HUD personnel to not approve loans for Dreamers or the class of young people known as DACA, individuals who, as you know, qualify for these loans. And I quote, the story in Chicago specifically had 42 FHA-backed loans approved for DACA recipients in recent years, about 10% of this total client base. HUD officials advised the bank that DACA recipients are not eligible for these loans. In 4 separate phone calls in a recent month to the FHA hotline for lenders, the loan officer said he was told that the agency would no longer ensure DACA recipients received home loans. Has HUD provided any guidance on this issue?
So in our conversations with HUD, they tell us that they have not changed policy, and that while DACA recipients were eligible for FHA loans before, and as far as the folks at the top are concerned, they are eligible for them now. But as you report, and as I've seen other reporting as well, that's not the message that is getting out in the field. And I think that what's needed is for HUD to make a very official and very firm and clear statement that policy has not changed and that DACA recipients are eligible to receive FHA loans.
Thank you. I yield back my elapsed time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Like the gentlewoman from New York, I apologize for not being here before. I was also in another committee, and I find it fascinating that it was such a related conversation. I was in the Judiciary Committee, and we're talking there about the Equality Act, H.R. 5. And so, Ms. Johnson, you very aptly said, we must name sexual orientation as a protected class. So the conversation in these two committees is going in the right direction, as frustrating as it is to run between the two. So please forgive me. But know that I also want to note, I'm new here, but this majority and these two committees are tackling very important issues of equality and fairness, and boy, I'm glad to be a part of those conversations. Ms. Goldberg, I was thinking about you, and I read your testimony. and the issue of disparate impact. And I say that because I represent Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, Norristown specifically. And just to go back into the issue of disparate impact, I know you've talked about it with some others, but I'm worried about something you said in your testimony, that it is possible that that rule would be eviscerated. So let me just tell you quickly the story, and I hope I'm not repeating anything, about what happened to the woman in Norristown. We know that disparate impact claims are paramount to allowing victims of discrimination to challenge policies that wrongly keep them from obtaining safe housing, or worse, endanger them or their loved ones. Specifically, attorneys use these rules to fight unintended consequences of nuisance ordinances. For example, in my district of Norristown, in Montgomery County and Norristown specifically, Lakeisha Briggs was a domestic violence survivor who had sustained life-threatening injuries from being beaten by her boyfriend and was simultaneously threatened with eviction after the police were called to her apartment the third time under a nuisance ordinance. Her injuries were so horrific that neighbors called the police, and she had to be airlifted to the hospital and treated. The case provides an important example of how disparate impact claims are imperative to helping domestic violence survivors, and particularly women. So, Ms. Goldberg, under the Trump administration and the possible threatening of evisceration of the rule, can you just speak to us about what the administration seems to be signaling they want to do with the rule and the grave dangers of that?
Thank you for that question, and thank you for that story. I hope that the woman you talked about survived and recovered.
She has survived.
So, and it's a perfect, one of many, many examples of the way that disparate impact has protected people in their housing. So we don't know exactly what the Trump administration is going to propose, because we have yet to see the proposed rule. It's, as far as we know, sitting right now at OMB, awaiting approval to be published for public comment. But what we do know is what HUD asked about in its advance notice of proposed rulemaking back last summer. And I would, for more detail, refer you to the comments that we and a long list of other organizations filed in response to that ANPR. And several of the issues that HUD raised as questions that it was considering, which makes you think that these may be directions it wants to take in changing the regulation, are very, very concerning. For example, should there be a wholesale exemption for certain types of businesses? Our read of the language they used was that it's a question about whether insurance, homeowners insurance, should be exempted whole hog because it's subject to regulation at the state level, and kind of alleging the industry for many years has alleged a conflict between the Fair Housing Act and the McCarran-Ferguson law. So there's several other things like that that are in the ANPR that just raise huge red flags for us about directions the administration might take that would really make this rule unworkable and unable to protect women like your constituent.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Johnson, I was thinking maybe you could help me. I'm listening to the testimony in the other hearing room about LGBTQ housing, not just shelter, but sometimes in shelter, and the great fear that a transgender person might get into a shelter and assault women. Would you like to speak to that kind of phantom fear-mongering? Sorry, I did just speak to it, didn't I? I just editorialized my own question. That's not right. Would you like to speak to the reality of LGBTQ issues in shelter, and then also in housing discrimination on a larger sense, not just in shelter?
Thank you so much. We know that transgender people, particularly transgender people of color, are more likely to experience poverty and homelessness because of systemic discrimination. And access to emergency shelter is critical to ensuring the health and safety of everyone facing housing insecurity. The reality is that we're seeing 1 in 4 transgender people who live, who are homeless at some point in their lives. And what is never okay is flat out denying people places to live. And this is something that we really have to address, right? We have to be talking about gender identity. We have to be talking about sexual orientation, and we have to acknowledge that there is real discrimination happening for people who are, who are same-sex loving, who do identify as transgender, and many of those people are also people of color, right? So the different types, the overlapping amounts of discrimination are also very real and create even more undue burden when you're trying to have and keep secure housing.
Thank you very much. And I see my time has expired. I seek unanimous consent.
Without objection.
Thank you. I ask that for the record, I'm able to introduce an article. It's an NPR report on the woman that I talked about in Norristown, and I offer that for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman yields back, and the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Garcia, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I, too, Ms. Johnson, I apologize, and to the whole panel, I, too, am sitting in judiciary this morning. I sometimes feel like I should be an octopus so I could just have my hands in everything, but that's not possible. But to add to my colleagues' comments, you know, help is on the way. I think we'll successfully get the Equality Act out of committee, and then we'll face the challenge of the votes in the House and then the Senate, of course. But I think that it, you know, I wish it would be simpler, that we just had one statement that said no discrimination, period. But it's not that way, and we all have to deal with it. So for me, and especially coming from Houston, and I wanted to start with Ms. Hill, I believe that, was it you who had the study, or was it Ms., no, actually it's Ms. Dr. Olson. You know, I don't know why anybody did a study on the inequities in terms of facilities found in metropolitan areas, because that could have saved you all the dollars living in Houston. You know, and it seems to me that it's more than just what you're mentioning here. You say that local establishments, amenities, including banks, health institutions, and recreational facilities are less prevalent in communities of color than white communities. I mean, I think it's more than that. Did you also look at healthcare and educational facilities and employment centers? I mean, it seems to me that it's more than just that, because it goes to the heart of, you know, good quality of life and, you know, our own well-being and our capacity to get a real fair shot at the American dream, doesn't it?
Yeah, and we looked at so financial services, both traditional and alternative. We looked at healthcare facilities. We looked at healthy food, like grocery stores where you can find Whole Foods. And then also recreational amenities like playgrounds, you know, for kids. Not just that, though, also gyms and, you know, parks of different kinds. So there were great disparities, and Houston actually held kind of the strongest disparity, particularly in the financial establishments, so traditional banking, and then also alternative finance. Houston was probably where there was the greatest divide between predominantly white communities and predominantly Black or Hispanic communities.
Right. So I guess I was trying to figure out just how something in fair housing would really help that, because to me sometimes it really is about incentives that we can provide for economic development, you know, incentives we can provide for businesses moving into communities of color, that I just wondered, you know, how we really connected that, and that's a question for anybody in the panel. Ms. Hill, you might want to take a stab at that one.
Well, I mean, I probably like to make this more tangible. So the inspiration for this research is very much in recognition of the fact that place matters so much to so many of our economic outcomes.
Place ultimately is who you are and what you're able to do.
Right, exactly. Your social mobility, your ability to start as a low-income family, say, and end up in middle class one day. So all of these things, you know, place is so very, very, very important. So why this study, why this amenity research, is I think when you say that to someone that place matters so much, sometimes you need to take that next step and make it more tangible, right? Like what is actually, you know, this really gets at the experiential difference that you can see and observe, but there are many other differences and disparities between communities of color and, say, predominantly white, and we measure those sorts of things too in terms of affordability differences.
Well, but what I'm driving at is what comes first, the affordable housing that that the developer is building, or do the amenities that come with it, and how you can get the two together?
Yeah, I think where it comes first goes back 100 years, you know, in terms of redlining, and then perpetuated through land use and regulation and zoning.
I wanted to ask the red line, but quickly, Ms. Hill, If you can add to that.
Oh, yes. Well, I would just say that it's important to think about all things happening at once rather than one thing happening first, because we know that it's going to take a multitude of policy changes and a wide-ranging approach in order to bring about true equitable access to housing.
Because it impacts everything, the job opportunities, how much you earn, whether you have daycare, what schools you have. And I was just totally confounded with your whole Facebook case. And what really struck me was the use of your words when you said, you know, they looked at the no discrimination options. I mean, why did they even have options? I mean, I find that baffling that you're actually talking about removing discriminatory options.
It's an excellent question I wish I had an answer. Can I just add one thing on your last question? I know time is up, but the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule that we've been talking about was designed to get at exactly what you're talking about. What kinds of investments do we need in communities in terms of all that kind of economic engine components, and what do we do about housing? And where, you know, where across the metro area or where across the city do we make affordable housing available? You know, do we need to target it to low-income communities? Do we need to target it elsewhere? The answer in each community will be different, but that's what the rule was intended to focus on, both of those things.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, the gentlelady yields. And the gentleman from Guam, Mr. San Nicolas, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate everybody being present here today. I particularly appreciate the committee and the hearing that's entitled The Fair Housing Act, Reviewing Efforts to Eliminate Discrimination and Promote Opportunity in Housing. There's been a lot of talk about redlining and its devastating effects that it's had on communities of color. But one of the most unfortunate facts that we deal with today that I think this country is very blind to is the fact that our territories are grossly redlined. They're very grossly redlined. I represent the territory of Guam. We have 91% of our population would qualify as minorities in this country. And in listening to the conversation of all the members of the panel, it sounds like everybody here is very much against the idea that we're going to be excluding anybody based on protected classes. And unfortunately, political jurisdiction is not a protected class. That being the case, as much as we have champions here in the panel, there's just certain things that in the course of my searching throughout the discussion, uncovered that just kind of highlight why territories need to be taken into very fair consideration. Dr. Olson, I really appreciated your testimony. I went to Zillow.com and I punched in Guam, and there is no Guam. Guam has 160,000 people and it's 210 square miles. Compared to Fairfield, California, with 116,000 people and 41 square miles, Fairfield, California is on Zillow.com. When I punched in on Zillow loans, none of the territories are able to access any of the Zillow loans. Ms. Johnson and Ms. Goldberg, you represent national organizations, and I wanted to ask, do your national organizations also include research on the territories with respect to the groups that you represent?
So that is an excellent question.
It's one of the reasons why I'm on this committee.
And I have to confess that I am, truthfully, so I'm not a data person, and I am not clear about the data that we have for Guam and other territories that would help guide some of this conversation. I can say we do not have a member there. It's one of many places where we don't, so it's not a function necessarily of being a territory, or we would say that about South Carolina, which doesn't have a fair housing organization either. But I think you raise an excellent question. We see parallels in some ways, I think, to what's been going on in Puerto Rico, for example, post-hurricane there, and in other ways as well. And I think it's one that we need to take back and take a close look at and figure out how we can help.
Thank you, Ms. Goldberg. Ms. Johnson?
We have done some research with the trans discrimination survey in Puerto Rico, but for the most part, we've done organizing work and less research, and we actually don't do on-the-ground work in any of the territories.
And I appreciate everybody's candor. And the reason why I wanted to raise this issue was I really think that the time has come for this country to stop neglecting the territories. I mean, everyone here at this panel I know are good people. No one's intentionally doing it. I think I I wrote down a quote from you, Ms. Goldberg, earlier. Many acts of discrimination are carried out by policies and procedures that might be unintentional. And I think that that's definitely a circumstance that we're dealing with here today. Our territories are predominantly minorities. You know, we can talk about trying to address minority disparities in various districts across the country, but our territories are mostly minorities, concentrations of minorities. And so if we're really looking to address the disparities with respect to access to credit, access to information about housing, access to data about what the conditions are in our areas, we need to make sure that we're not forgetting our territories when we go about our work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, for 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. All right. So when President Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act into law, he stated, and I quote, "Now with this bill, the voice of justice speaks again. It proclaims that fair housing for all human beings who live in this country, is now a part of the American way of life. Housing is a human right. Housing is a critical determinant of health, of economic opportunity, of social mobility. In my district, the Massachusetts 7th, an urban district that spans from Cambridge to Roxbury, housing and income disparities have led to a gap in median income of $50,000. As a result, the life expectancy rate drops from 92 years old in the Back Bay to 62 years old in Roxbury. Though the housing market has recovered from the 2007 recession, low-income and minority communities are still recovering from being the victims of rampant foreclosures and predatory subprime lending. They still face immense barriers to home ownership, discriminatory practices with minority home ownership rates continuing to lag, and our affordable rental housing crisis is only worsening. And yet, in the face of this blatant deterioration of American families and of the housing market, we find ourselves stuck with an administration that deliberately works to reinstate the very housing discriminations that we sought to dismantle through the 1968 Fair Housing Act. I am delighted to see all of you here today as witnesses, but I must admit I wish Secretary Carson were here. I know we have a chairwoman who has a gavel and isn't afraid to use it, so I look forward to him joining us one day soon. As someone who was raised by a tenants' rights activist in a low-income neighborhood, I witnessed firsthand the challenges faced by those of us who were left out of the housing conversation. I am again grateful for each and every one of you today, and I want to get, in the balance of my time, into some questions specifically around the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Ms. Goldberg, the Housing Choice Voucher Program is the largest source of federal rental assistance and has great potential to help families choose where they want to live. However, a recent report by the Poverty and Race Research Action Council and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities found that families using a voucher in metropolitan areas are disproportionately concentrated in low opportunity and racially segregated neighborhoods. In the Boston area, just 14% of families with children using a Housing Choice Voucher are living in high opportunity neighborhoods. How can the Housing Choice Voucher Program be improved to increase access to opportunities for families and reducing poverty?
Thank you for that question. It can be a very important tool to expanding choice for families, but it needs some tweaking. HUD has taken some first steps at that, although I will say this administration tried to delay the rule that would have moved that ahead and only reinstated it after being sued. But Ms. Hill started to talk about this a little bit earlier, that housing prices vary by geographic area, right? And the way that the housing voucher has worked is that we set one rent limit, right? And then the voucher will pay for the amount of that rent that's above 30% of your income, you as the tenant. And so that lets you afford apartments in some neighborhoods, the neighborhoods where rents are lower, but not in neighborhoods where rents are higher, which are often the ones with good schools and good transportation and all of those things that we all look for in a neighborhood. There is the opportunity to adjust those rent limits to conform with the rents in a smaller area than the whole metropolitan area. And that there's a mobility project that HUD has authorized for, I believe it's 24 is now requiring in 24 metropolitan areas around the country, it can be done voluntarily in others. And that's the kind of change that lets housing choice voucher
Sorry,
holders...
reclaiming my time. I'm going to run out of time. Yes or no, is there an argument to be made that race and not income can better explain the disparities we see in access to opportunity? Yes.
So I think that's an excellent question. And yes, I would say, because we see discrimination against people of color, for example, at all income levels. It is not just a question of income.
Very good.
It's also a question of race.
Thank you. Reclaiming my time. The Massachusetts 7th Congressional District is home to the largest public housing authority in New England. How does the FHA ensure protection from housing discrimination for vulnerable groups, and what does this practice look like? Oh, I've got 8 seconds.
So I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer that. I know that there have been a number of different kinds of
direct
cases
that to
in
Ms.
public
Hill.
housing. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
So the question is about public housing authorities?
Yes, and how do we protect vulnerable groups?
So I do think that working with housing authorities to ensure that they are administering the voucher program in a way that deconcentrates poverty but truly allows access to neighborhoods of opportunity is a great place to start. We know that across the country there has been a trend toward getting rid of the traditional public housing developments and moving public housing residents to the voucher system. And so with the majority of folks in that system rather than living in public housing, we've got to ensure that we are administering the voucher program in a way that does give access to these high opportunity neighborhoods.
And it seems, you know, since our population is aging, the baby boomers are booming. What are we doing specifically, or what can we do to protect the retiree population? Oh, am I out of time? Oh, Mr. Chair, I'm so sorry. I was looking at the wrong clock here. All right, I yield my time. Thank you. Okay.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Tlaib, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank all of you so much for your continued advocacy to also work extremely hard to put a human face behind some of these legal terminologies that I think are in place here. It is very odd because Secretary Ben Carson and I went to the same high school. And sometimes, I mean, I remember a 16-year-old girl in high school as he came in, and he was phenomenal. He had just written the book about his like historic surgery and separating twins. I mean, it was phenomenal. And he actually said, it doesn't matter, you know, how you grew up. If you work hard enough, you'll succeed. So it's really troubling as in January 2018, under Secretary Carson's leadership, HUD halted implementation of the agency's affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. Under his leadership, he reportedly proposed removing the words, quote, free from discrimination from HUD's mission statement. In March 2017, under Secretary Carson's leadership, HUD withdrew a Federal Register notice regarding a proposal to require owners and operators of HUD-funded homeless shelters to post a notice informing individuals of their rights under HUD's, quote, equal access to coordinates with an individual's gender identity and community planning and development programs. Even though we've seen a huge hike, I think the LGBTQ youth in the U.S. are 120% more likely to experience homelessness than non-LGBTQ youth, and 94% of the service providers report working with LGBTQ youth today. I come from a community that literally every corner is a reminder of the civil rights movement. I remember in college signing up for Fair Housing Detroit, being a secret shopper. I was very good at it. And I took great notes and came back and talked about, you know, watching these slides, talking about little notes or little questions they would ask you. Do you have children? Things like that. They're getting savvy in how they do go around this. That's why disparate impact is so important. And many of you know I intend introducing Justice for All Civil Rights Act. You know, over 50 years, the courts, everyone has watered down and gone around this idea around, you know, having to show intent, when I'm like, no, they're working the system and now they're going around and showing, and that's why disparate impact is so important, looking at the implementation of these policies and what they result in. And so I want to know from all of you, like, give me some examples of just how creative they're getting. No, really, and getting around that. And especially because many of my residents going door to door, and especially my colleague from Massachusetts, I think we talked about this before, of women with children and being targeted now. Give me some examples of what you've actually seen them use, some terminologies, getting around this, and why disparate impact is so important.
I wasn't planning on sharing a personal story, but I will. I am a single mom of 2 and I live in DC, was looking for a neighborhood where I could feel good about where my kids went to school. I went to public school, wanted them to go to public school, was looking to rent a house. I was talking, the landlord met my kids, I'm who I am. My partner came and visited one of those times and the landlord says, I'm not sure this is gonna work for you. I'm like, it's 4 people in a 3-bedroom house that's 3 levels, that is walking distance to the school. So little language like that, a landlord where it's coded language, I'm not sure this is gonna work for you. It was like a smack in the face. Like I didn't even know what to do with that. And I'm in a privileged place. And so that's one example of the many, many ways we see coded language used.
One of the things that I've also been hearing, so coming from Detroit or Wayne County, huge, still very segregated communities to this day. 51 years after the passage of the Fair Housing Act, the historic, what we call the Detroit 8-mile wall that was erected to separate blacks and whites, it still exists. It's still the symbol. When I drive by it, it's still there. Will addressing restrictive zoning policies alone eliminate fair housing concerns and residential segregation? I know it's a tough question, but it's important.
So I would say absolutely not. It is one important tool, but it is not going to get the job done. We need to attack this on all fronts, and just changing the zoning, there is no one magic bullet. If there were, we would have found it already. As you mentioned, it's been 51 years and we haven't solved the problem yet. That one solution will not do it.
I would just add to that, if I could. So changing zoning does not make housing affordable, right? Or it depends perhaps on affordable to whom. You need to be clear. So if you're talking about people who are low and moderate income, no housing that you construct in this day and age, even if you can lower some of the costs through zoning changes, is going to make the housing affordable. It's like putting water in a trough, but you can't make the horse drink it, right? You can't make the developer build it. And as Kashana said, it only gets at one small piece of the problem. We have many more other parts of it that need to be addressed as well.
Thank you all. And Mr. Chairman, if possible, I would like to submit for the record an article, March 21st, 2019, in the Detroit Free Press, talking about few black people get home mortgages in Detroit and showing the data of literally half of the home mortgages loans in 2017 were white residents in Detroit, and I would like to submit this for record.
Without objection, so ordered. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. First of all, I want to thank all of the panelists for your remarkable testimony and for helping the committee with its work. Ms. Johnson, I have a question. So in your testimony, you mentioned there are 21 states, including the District of Columbia, that have language that prevent discrimination against LGBTQ persons in housing. Do we have comparative data to strengthen the argument on the national level that we should adopt this nationally? Are there examples where the data shows that this is a great thing, it's working, and it'll help more families if we go nationally?
I'm sure we could get some data to the committee that could help you with that.
That would be enormously helpful, I think. And I'm sure it exists. It's just it hasn't been, collected or quantified yet. My own situation, I grew up in public housing. My dad says there were times in our life when we had to save up to be poor. And I first got involved in housing, representing families in the old colony housing projects. That's sort of how I got elected here. Just cases on lead paint, asbestos, 6 kids and a mom living in an apartment with 1 bedroom and 1 bathroom, those type of things. But the world has changed. Even the process of searching for and acquiring an apartment, everything's mobile now. And I know, Ms. Hill, in some of your testimony and others, we talk about, how Facebook and others have sort of manipulated this in a way that furthers discrimination. the democratization of the housing process through mobile should actually be, you know, could be an instrument of equality rather than discrimination. And I'm just wondering if you know, I know Zillow has really got into this big time in terms of offering apartments to rent and to buy. Is there any recommendation that any of you would make with respect to sort of the digitization, the social media aspect of this in terms of just transforming the whole rental process for especially for young people? They're all on mobile. Everything's on their phones and smartphones. So our regulations are set up for the old world. They really are. And we don't really get at this. And I'm just wondering, in your experience, if you would, you know, offer some recommendations in how we might better protect people from discrimination in housing.
Is that directed to any particular one of us?
Okay. Anyone, yeah. Ms. Olson? Dr. Olson?
I think, you know, I think one of the ways that I can respond, right, as someone who's, I mean, I study housing markets at Zillow, but someone who has, you know, worked at Zillow now for over 6 years, that a big part of our overall philosophy is to try and provide that information in a way that's easily consumable, both for renters and buyers on our site, in order to do, as you say, right, to democratize the access to that information, to solve for a lot of those information asymmetries. But I think, as this panel has also acknowledged, is that there's still a lot of room to grow, right? There's a lot of things that we need to recognize when we put these kinds of things in place. And my organization is dedicated to looking at those issues. We've formed working groups in order to try and tackle concerns that this panel has had. I can't, as not looking at this, this issue really deeply in terms of the policy perspective of it, but I could say, you know, this is central to our value system, and it's an important thing for everyone to be looking at.
So I would just add to that, if I could, that I think you are completely right, that mobile gives a lot of opportunities or possibility for democratization, but if the systems that are utilizing that mobile technology are built on discriminatory data and reflect the biases that are inherent and historic in our society, then it's not going to work the way we would all hope it would work. And so we need more transparency, we need better oversight, and we need to make sure that the laws that govern the use of that kind of technology, like the Communications Decency Act, don't impede our ability to use the Fair Housing Act to make sure that discrimination is not taking place on mobile platforms or anything else.
Right. Thank you very, very much. I see my time has expired. I would like to thank all of our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional material to the chair for inclusion in the record. And this hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.